May 1941. The North Atlantic is already saturated with convoy routes carrying thousands of tons of food, oil, steel, and ammunition from North America toward Britain every week. German Naval Command decides to fracture those lifelines using one of the largest warships ever built in Europe. The ship is Bismarck, a battleship displacing roughly 50,000 tons when fully loaded, protected by armor belts more than 12 inches thick, and armed with 8 15-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing roughly 1,760 pounds each across distances exceeding 20 miles. When that ship leaves port, an entire ocean begins to tighten around it. The operation begins quietly. On May 18, 1941, Bismarck departs from Gotenhafen in occupied Poland, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. The German plan appears simple on paper: break into the Atlantic, attack Allied shipping, and fracture the supply arteries feeding Britain. Convoys crossing the ocean sometimes carried cargo measured in tens of thousands of tons: grain, aviation fuel, artillery shells, trucks, and spare aircraft parts. Even a single successful raider could stall those lifelines. Inside Bismarck's steel hull, more than 2,200 sailors prepare the battleship for the voyage. Engines generating over 150,000 horsepower push the ship through cold, northern waters. Each of the 4 propellers churns the Atlantic with a force capable of driving the vessel beyond 30 knots, roughly 35 miles per hour. Below decks, fuel bunkers hold thousands of tons of oil necessary to sustain the operation. Picture the gunnery crew standing beside one of those massive 15-inch naval guns. Each shell weighs nearly 1 ton. The loading mechanism grinds as hydraulic systems push the projectile into the breech. Powder charges stacked nearby carry enough explosive force to launch that shell across miles of ocean. When the gun fires, the shock travels through the steel structure of the ship like a physical wave. British intelligence detects the breakout quickly. Naval Command in London orders a massive search across the North Atlantic. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers fan out across thousands of square miles of ocean. The Royal Navy commits ships displacing hundreds of thousands of tons combined, each vessel burning fuel measured in thousands of gallons every day during high-speed pursuit. The first violent collision occurs in the Denmark Strait on May 24th. British battlecruiser HMS Hood, displacing about 47,000 tons, closes distance with Bismarck. Hood carries 8 15-inch guns, similar in caliber to the German battleship's weapons. Nearby sails the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales, armed with 10 14-inch guns. The ship's close to within roughly 15 miles. Then the guns begin firing. Shells weighing over 1,500 pounds streak through the gray Atlantic sky. Water erupts in towering columns around the ships as ranging shots fall short or long. Within minutes, one of Bismarck's shells penetrates Hood's deck armor. The explosion fractures the British battlecruiser from within. Witnesses describe a violent column of flame erupting through the ship's midsection. The vessel breaks apart in less than 3 minutes. Out of 1,418 crew members, only 3 survive. The destruction of Hood shocks the British Admiralty. Orders spread instantly across the fleet: find Bismarck and destroy it. Nearly every available warship in the North Atlantic begins moving toward the suspected escape route. I remember the first time I examined the naval dispatches from those 8 days of pursuit. What struck me was the sheer geography involved. The Atlantic is enormous. Searching for a single battleship across thousands of square miles of water becomes a problem of mathematics, radio signals, reconnaissance flights, and sheer endurance. Meanwhile, Bismarck itself does not escape unscathed. During the battle with Prince of Wales, the German battleship absorbs hits that rupture fuel tanks. Oil begins leaking behind the ship, leaving a visible trail across the ocean. Engineers estimate that hundreds of tons of fuel have been compromised, limiting how far the vessel can travel without refueling. Down in the engine rooms, sailors work beside machinery vibrating under tremendous pressure. Turbines spin at thousands of revolutions per minute, while engineers monitor gauges measuring steam pressure and fuel flow. Above them, the Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction. British reconnaissance aircraft eventually locate the battleship again. Torpedo bombers, launched from the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, approach through rough weather on May 26th. Each aircraft carries a torpedo weighing roughly 1,600 pounds, designed to detonate beneath a ship's armored hull. One torpedo strikes near Bismarck's stern. The explosion fractures the steering gear. The battleship's rudder jams at an angle, leaving the massive ship circling slowly instead of racing toward safety. A warship weighing 50,000 tons now struggles to steer across open water. Inside the hull, the crew attempts repairs under dim emergency lighting. Tools clang against metal as engineers attempt to free the jammed rudder assembly. Water sprays through damaged compartments while pumps strain to stabilize the ship. But time collapses quickly. By dawn on May 27th, British battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney close in. Rodney alone carries 9 16-inch guns, each firing shells weighing more than 2,000 pounds. The distance between the ships shrinks steadily. Then the bombardment begins. Salvo after salvo crashes into Bismarck. Armor plates fracture, turrets jam, fires spread through upper decks. Shells weighing over 2,000 pounds slam into the hull with tremendous force. The once powerful battleship bleeds smoke and steel into the gray Atlantic. When the battle ends, Bismarck sinks beneath the waves roughly 400 miles west of France. More than 2,000 sailors disappear with the ship. Whenever I revisit this episode in naval history, I find myself imagining the final, quiet moments after the guns stopped firing. The Atlantic does not hold memory the way land battlefields do. Waves simply roll across the same surface again and again, erasing every trace of what happened. And if you happen to be listening while the night grows quiet and the rhythm of the ocean almost feels audible in the background, picture that vast stretch of water where fleets once raced for 8 relentless days. Engines roared, shells weighing a ton screamed through the air, and entire warships collided in a search that stretched across the Atlantic. This is the entire history of the hunt for the Bismarck. 8 days across the Atlantic during the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Ship That Was Never Supposed to Exist. The 14th of February, 1939, Hamburg. The Blohm & Voss shipyard sits on the southern bank of the Elbe, and on this particular morning, the air carries the particular cold of a North German winter, the kind that gets into the seams of your coat and stays there. The yard has been working on this hull for nearly 3 years. Keel plate number 509 was laid down on the 1st of July, 1936, and what has grown up from it since then is enormous. Not just large in the way that ships are large, enormous in a way that makes the men standing on the slipway look like a different species entirely. The ship they are about to launch has not yet been given a name publicly, though in the internal documents of the Kriegsmarine, she has one. She is called Bismarck, and there is something about this morning, the flags, the speeches, the cold, that feels less like a celebration and more like the formal signing of a very complicated document. What strikes me, looking back at the administrative record of this ship's birth, is how much of it was built on a contradiction that everyone involved understood perfectly well and no one was supposed to acknowledge. The 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement, signed in London, ratified with considerable diplomatic fanfare, permitted Germany to build surface warships up to 35,000 tons standard displacement. That was the Washington Treaty limit. That was the number Germany had agreed to. The internal Kriegsmarine planning documents, however, and some of these survive in the German naval archives, had been working from a very different set of figures almost from the beginning. The actual standard displacement as designed was approximately 41,700 tons. The full load displacement when she finally left for her only operational mission in May 1941 would be closer to 50,900 tons. Someone, somewhere in the Reichsmarineamt in the early 1930s, had written down one number for the foreign observers and a different number for the engineers. And the engineers built the bigger ship. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it isn't just administrative dishonesty. It has operational consequences that echo through every chapter of this story. A ship designed at 35,000 tons and a ship designed at 50,000 tons are not the same problem for an enemy to solve. The armor scheme is different. The magazine protection is different. The fuel capacity is different. The very fact that she floats at a different waterline changes how shells strike her belt. When Grand Admiral Raeder stood up at Nuremberg after the war and was asked about warship displacement, he chose his words with the care of a man who had been doing this for a long time. The excerpts from that testimony are archived and available, and reading them is an education in how bureaucratic language is used to make a lie technically defensible. He didn't deny the numbers. He contextualized them. There's a difference, and not a flattering one. The armor protection system on this ship was a genuine feat of engineering, and I think it deserves more attention than it typically gets in the popular accounts, which tend to skip past it to get to the battles. The main belt armor, running along the waterline amidships, was 320 millimeters of Wotan Harte face-hardened steel. That's roughly 12.5 inches. But the more interesting detail is the inclination. That belt was angled 12 degrees from vertical. When a shell strikes an inclined plate, the effective resistance is greater than the measured thickness suggests, because the shell has to travel through more material to reach the interior. The calculated equivalent vertical protection was closer to 345 millimeters. Beyond that, the anti-torpedo protection system used a layered cellular arrangement. Void space, then fuel tank, then void space, then a 45mm torpedo bulkhead set roughly 4.5 meters inboard from the ship's outer hull. The theory was that a torpedo detonation would exhaust its energy through this sequence of spaces before reaching the machinery. The theory was, for the most part, correct. It would take something much more specific to kill this ship from the outside. The commissioning ceremony took place on the 24th of August, 1940. Captain Ernst Lindemann delivered a speech that survives in the German archive, a formal document, the kind that gets written up for the record. What he said, in the version preserved in the official documents, was that the ship would not return in defeat. There's a later recollection by Korvettenkapitän Gerhard Unach, the engineering officer who would one day be the last senior technical officer still operating in the ship's engine spaces, that the captain's words were slightly different, that the ship would never surrender. These are not the same statement. One is about the outcome of battle. The other is about a choice. I keep coming back to that distinction because on the 27th of May, 1941, the question of whether Bismarck was sunk or chose to sink would become one of the most fiercely debated questions in naval history. And it begins, perhaps, with the precise words a captain used on a cold August morning in Kiel that nobody thought to write down exactly. The political context for this ship's existence is inseparable from the figure of Adolf Hitler, and that context carries its own complications that the naval planning documents don't fully capture. The Führer Naval Conference records, a remarkable collection of minutes from meetings between Hitler and his naval commanders, archived and available to researchers, show a man who was simultaneously proud of his large warships and terrified of losing them. As early as 1940, Hitler was asking Raeder whether the Bismarck could be risked in the kind of operation for which she had been designed. Raeder's answers were consistently reassuring. They had to be. The logic of the entire surface raider program depended on those ships actually sailing. But there's a tension in those conference minutes. A dictator seeking permission from his own instincts, and an admiral providing it in the form of professional confidence that would resurface in a much more consequential way in the spring of 1941. Hitler visited the ship at Gotenhafen, the German name for what is now Gdynia in Poland, on the 5th of May 1941. Roughly 2 weeks before she sailed. This visit is documented in the conference records. He was not enthusiastic. The precise question he raised was about air cover, whether Bismarck could expect fighter protection in the Atlantic, where she would be operating far beyond the range of Luftwaffe bases. The honest answer was no. The answer Raeder gave was more nuanced than that, and the conference minutes record it with the careful ambiguity of a professional who knows the difference between what is true and what is useful. Hitler didn't cancel the operation. He didn't formally approve it either. He simply stopped asking. In the bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich, that silence was authorization enough. There's a detail in the March 1941 maintenance records that I find particularly striking when I cross-reference it with the damage reports from the 24th of May. In early March of that year, Bismarck was in the floating dock at the Marinewerft in Kiel. The interrogation report of survivors, assembled by British Naval Intelligence and archived at the U-Boat Archive, references this docking for what appears to have been routine maintenance work and potentially assessment of the forward fuel transfer system. This was the last time the ship was in a German dry dock. The forward oil cells, specifically the sections in the bow area that would later be compromised by a shell from HMS Prince of Wales, were assessed and sealed at this point. Or not fully sealed. The records are incomplete on this specific question, and I want to be honest about that gap rather than paper over it. What I can say is that 3 months later, when a 14-inch shell pierced the port bow in those exact forward sections, the damage proved uncontrollable. Whether better maintenance work in March could have changed that is one of the questions the archive cannot answer. The supply network that Grand Admiral Raeder's staff assembled for Operation Rheinübung, the code name for Bismarck's operational sortie, was, in its own way, more impressive than the ship herself. 7 vessels were positioned across the North Atlantic in a grid system keyed to Kriegsmarine quadrant coordinates. The tankers Weissenberg, Haida, Belchen, Lothringen, Esso Hamburg, Friedrich Brehm, and the supply ship Spitzern. Each tanker carried between 6,000 and 10,000 tons of naval fuel. The theory was that Bismarck, with a full bunker capacity of approximately 7,780 cubic meters, could conduct extended commerce raiding operations in the mid-Atlantic, replenishing from this network as needed for weeks. At standard cruising speed of 19 knots, the ship burned roughly 300 cubic meters of fuel per day. At 30 knots in combat conditions, that figure nearly tripled. The logistics were sophisticated and carefully planned. The combat element, 1 battleship and 1 heavy cruiser, was underpowered for the mission, and everyone involved knew it. By the time Bismarck cleared the Skagerrak barrier on the 19th of May, 1941, the ship that the world's naval observers believed to be a 35,000-ton treaty-compliant warship was in fact a 50,000-ton weapon system built on a documented lie. Commissioned by a captain whose exact words are disputed, authorized by a political leader whose enthusiasm was qualified at best, sailing on an operation whose own flag officer had recommended postponing, protected by armor that would prove nearly impenetrable from the outside, but vulnerable through a specific geometric accident in the bow, and trailed by a supply network that would survive it by less than 3 weeks. That is the ship. That is the beginning. Chapter 2. Reader's Obsession. The Theory of the Commerce Raider. The 2nd of April, 1941, Berlin. In the Seekriegsleitung, the German Naval War Staff headquarters, the planning documents for Operation Rheinübung are taking their formal shape. Outside, spring has technically arrived in the German capital, though nobody working in the planning offices would have noticed. The rooms smell of cigarette smoke, and the particular dry warmth of buildings that are heated too aggressively in winter and never quite adjust in spring. The men in those rooms are working with charts, with fuel tables, with convoy route maps that show the North Atlantic as a grid of shipping lanes and choke points. On paper, the operation they are designing is elegant. A powerful surface raiding group, built around the world's heaviest operational battleship, drives into the Atlantic convoy lanes, destroys merchant shipping at a rate that British yards cannot replace, and withdraws before the Royal Navy can concentrate sufficient force to respond. The concept has a pedigree. It had worked, after a fashion, before. The intellectual foundation of the German surface raider strategy belongs almost entirely to Raeder, and understanding it requires going back further than May 1941, Back to the naval doctrine debates of the 1920s and 1930s, when German naval planners were trying to design a fleet that could threaten British global supply lines without being able to match the Royal Navy in open fleet engagement. The concept they arrived at was the Kreuzerkrieg, the cruiser war, or commerce war, using fast, powerful surface ships, not to fight enemy fleets, but to destroy the merchant traffic on which Britain's island economy depended. The Bismarck class was designed with this mission in mind: fast enough at 30 knots to outrun most capital ships, powerful enough with 8 15-inch guns to destroy any convoy escort, and with a range sufficient to operate in the mid-Atlantic without immediate support. When Vice Admiral Günther Lütjens returned from Operation Berlin in late March of 1941, having led the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau on a 2-month Atlantic sortie that sank or captured 22 vessels, Raeder saw confirmation of everything he had built his career on. The numbers from Operation Berlin looked impressive in isolation. 115,622 gross registered tons of Allied shipping destroyed. 22 vessels. 2 months at sea. To Raeder's staff, this was evidence that the strategy worked. To me, sitting with those figures alongside the U-boat tonnage tables for the same period, the arithmetic tells a more complicated story. In January 1941 alone, German submarines sank 53 ships, totaling approximately 320,000 gross registered tons. In February, the figure was a similar order of magnitude. The surface raiders were destroying shipping at roughly 15% of the monthly rate that the U-boat fleet was achieving, and the U-boats were doing it with vessels that cost a fraction of the price to build, required a fraction of the crew, and didn't require a 7-ship logistics network spread across the North Atlantic to keep them operational. Raeder knew these figures. He chose to read them as complementary rather than competitive. That was, I think, the most consequential analytical error of the entire Atlantic campaign. Lütjens himself was not enthusiastic about the timing of Rheinübung, and this matters enormously. His war diary, the entries from late March through mid-May 1941 survive and are archived at kbismarck.com, contains a written recommendation that is cautious to the point of pessimism. He wanted to wait until the battleship Tirpitz was fully worked up and ready for operations, which would have provided a genuine 2-battleship raiding group. He wanted to explore whether the French battleship Richelieu, captured at Dakar and potentially available for Axis use, could be incorporated into a larger surface force. He wanted to wait for better conditions. Raeder overruled him. The conversation between the two men, what was actually said, in what tone, with what degree of explicit disagreement, is not preserved in the accessible record. What is preserved is the outcome. Lütjens sailed on an operation he had formally recommended delaying, under orders from a superior who had convinced a dictator the mission was viable. This is not a recipe for the kind of operational freedom that successful commerce raiding requires. The Gneisenau problem is worth pausing on, because it's the kind of detail that tends to disappear in the action-focused accounts. The original planning directive for Rheinübung, the Seekriegsleitung Operational Order, archived at kbismarck.com, had called for Gneisenau to participate alongside Bismarck, providing the kind of 2 heavy-ship striking force that might genuinely have overwhelmed any convoy escort the British could deploy. On the 6th of April 1941, a British air attack on the port of Brest put Gneisenau out of action. Just like that, the balanced raiding group became a lone battleship with a cruiser escort. Then the coupling fault on Prinz Eugen delayed departure from the planned April new moon period. New moon was the 26th of April, pushing the operation into mid-May, when nights at 65 degrees north latitude are barely 3 hours long. The darkness that Lütjens had counted on for his Denmark Strait passage essentially ceased to exist as a tactical resource. The operation launched anyway. Each individual delay had a specific mechanical cause. The cumulative effect was that Bismarck entered the most dangerous phase of her operation in near-continuous Arctic daylight, with half the fighting strength originally planned, commanded by an officer who had told his superiors he wasn't ready. The fuel mathematics of Rheinübung deserve close attention, because they're the invisible architecture underneath everything that follows. Bismarck's full bunker capacity was approximately 7,780 cubic meters of naval fuel. At her standard cruising speed of 19 knots, she burned approximately 300 cubic meters per day. At 24 knots, the speed she would maintain for much of the operation, that figure rose to roughly 450 cubic meters. At the combat speeds she would need for the Denmark Strait approach, consumption approached or exceeded 800 cubic meters per day. The tanker Weissenberg was positioned as her first refueling contact, designed to top her off after the high-speed breakout passage before she entered Atlantic operations proper. The arithmetic worked. On paper, with clean assumptions, with no battle damage to the forward oil cells. The Atlantic Operation Report, the official German post-battle analysis, compiled from radio transcripts and survivor accounts, because the ship's own war diary went down with her, contains a fuel table that makes for sobering reading. The numbers start neat. They stop being neat on the 24th of May. When I was working through the operational directive in the fleet commander's own planning orders, both archived at kbismarck.com and available to anyone who cares to read them, I kept returning to one specific passage in Lütjen's operational order, dated the 22nd of April, 1941. He states his intention to attempt the Denmark Strait breakthrough and explicitly acknowledges the possibility of being detected by British cruisers during the passage. His plan for that contingency is to engage light forces if necessary, but to conserve the battle group for sustained Atlantic operations, avoiding fleet engagement with capital ships. This is sensible doctrine. What it doesn't account for is the possibility that the British would have two capital ships waiting at the exit of the Denmark Strait, positioned precisely because they'd received good intelligence about his route. The operational order was written for a scenario in which German intelligence about British fleet dispositions was reliable. It wasn't. The 7 supply ships positioned for Rheinübung represent something I find genuinely impressive about the German naval planning staff, even in a chapter about a strategic concept that was already failing. The logistics network was sophisticated and well executed. The Belchen, the Lothringen, the Esso Hamburg, the Friedrich Bram, the Spickern, each positioned at specific quadrant coordinates in the North Atlantic grid, each carrying sufficient fuel to conduct multiple replenishment operations. The communication system connecting them to Fleet Command was encrypted and, German planners believed, secure. The whole structure was elegant in the way that engineering solutions are elegant. It solved the problem it was designed to solve. The problem it wasn't designed to solve was what happened when the British, using intelligence sources that the German naval staff didn't know were operating at the depth they were, located and destroyed all 7 vessels within 3 weeks of the operation ending. Every tanker, every supply ship, gone by mid-June. The logistics infrastructure that had taken months to assemble was dismantled in days. But that comes later. It fascinates me how the official German post-battle assessment, the Atlantic Operation Report, handles the question of whether Rheinübung should have been launched at all. The document is meticulous. It reconstructs the operation's timeline from radio intercepts and survivor accounts with impressive precision. It discusses the fuel calculations, the route decisions, the missed opportunities. What it doesn't do is ask whether the fundamental strategic premise was sound, whether a single battleship, however powerful, could realistically have achieved the monthly sinking rate of 750,000 gross registered tons that Radar's planning staff had calculated as necessary for strategic effect. That question isn't in the report. It couldn't be, really. The report was compiled by the same institutional culture that had produced the plan. But it's the question that sits underneath every careful page of operational analysis, unanswered. By the evening of the 18th of May, 1941, the support fleet was already in motion. The reconnaissance ships Gotenhafen and Gotenhafen had left La Pallice the day before. The weather ship network was operational. The tanker grid was in position. And in Gotenhafen harbor, under a sky that was already staying light until nearly midnight, the battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen were completing their final preparations. The operations commander had formally recommended delay. The operations political patron had expressed qualified enthusiasm at best. The operational force was half what the planning documents had specified, and the supply network, the genuine engineering achievement of the whole enterprise, was already, without anyone in the German naval staff knowing it, operating in waters that were less secret than they appeared. The ship sailed at midnight on the 19th of May. The North Sea was calm. Chapter 3. The Eyes of the Enemy. British Intelligence Before the Breakout. The 20th of May, 1941. The Kattegat, the body of water between Denmark and Sweden, one of the busiest shipping passages in northern Europe, and, in the second year of the war, one of the most carefully watched. The Swedish mine cruiser Gotland is on a routine coastal patrol, moving through clear visibility in the kind of Baltic spring weather that makes the water look almost benign. She is a neutral vessel. Sweden has maintained a careful, complicated neutrality throughout the war, trading with both sides, observing both sides, saying very little publicly about either. Her captain files a routine observation report when he sees the German formation, 2 large warships, flanked by destroyers and aircraft. It's a naval observation. That's what naval observers do. He isn't at war with anyone. His report goes up through Swedish naval channels, and from there, through the particular architecture of wartime intelligence relationships, it reaches the British naval attaché in Stockholm within hours. 2 large warships on a northerly course. The Baltic is no longer a place to practice gunnery. The British response to the Gotland report moved faster than most accounts give it credit for. By the evening of the 20th of May, RAF Coastal Command had been tasked to investigate. This is where the intelligence chain becomes genuinely interesting to trace, because the sources don't entirely agree on what happened next and when. What is clear from the Admiralty War Diary from May 1941, archived at kbismarck.com, is that reconnaissance aircraft flew over the Bergen fjords on the night of the 21st and into the 22nd of May. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, was the critical piece of information. The anchorages that Bismarck had used during her brief stop on the 21st were empty. The Germans had already gone. The RAF pilots had flown into the Norwegian darkness and come back with photographs of vacant water. And in the intelligence business, a vacant anchorage can tell you more than a full one. It tells you the ship has sailed. Now the question was, where? The Atlantic Operation Report, the German side's own post-battle reconstruction, acknowledges, with some precision, that the departure of the battle group through the Great Belt and Kattegat was observed by what it calls the Enemy Observation and Intelligence Service, which is known to work very well. This is an interesting admission in a military document. The report goes on to note that British aircraft were instructed to look for, in translation, 2 battleships and 3 destroyers on a northerly course, following what appears to have been an agent report. The Gotland observation filtered through the Swedish intelligence connection in Stockholm. The Germans knew they had been seen. What they didn't fully know was how quickly that sighting had been acted on, or how completely it had been corroborated. The aerial reconnaissance that found empty fjords on the 21st confirmed the intelligence picture that the Gotland report had opened. By the morning of the 22nd of May, Admiral Sir John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the British Home Fleet, had enough to act on. Tovey's response to the intelligence picture is worth examining in some detail, because it's often described as a straightforward scramble, when in fact it was a carefully weighted deployment under conditions of genuine uncertainty. He knew the Germans had left Bergen. He didn't know with certainty which route they intended to take: the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland to the north, or the Iceland-Faroe Passage further south. He dispatched the heavy cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk to watch the Denmark Strait, and he held his capital ships at Scapa Flow while waiting for the intelligence picture to clarify. What he didn't know, and what the Atlantic Operation Report reveals with considerable clarity, was that German aerial reconnaissance of Scapa Flow on the 22nd of May had reported the home fleet still at anchor. 4 battleships, apparently, still in harbor. This report was wrong. Tovey had already sailed much of his force. The German reconnaissance aircraft had photographed, at least in part, auxiliary vessels, or been fooled by the light conditions, and the assessment had been transmitted to Lutyens as reassurance. He entered the Denmark Strait believing the bulk of the home fleet was still in Scapa. It was not. HMS Suffolk's role in the next phase of the operation is one that deserves more technical discussion than it usually gets. Suffolk was a county-class heavy cruiser, 8-inch guns, 32 knots top speed, and, crucially, for what happened on the 23rd of May, she had been recently refitted with the Type 271 surface search radar. This was a relatively new equipment fit, and it gave her a capability that Lutyens' intelligence assessments had significantly underestimated. The Type 271 operated in the 10-centimeter band and could detect a large surface vessel at ranges of up to roughly 12 to 13 nautical miles in poor visibility conditions. The Denmark Strait in late May offered visibility that varied between clear and approximately 400 meters of fog and ice haze. Suffolk's radar cut through the haze. At 19:22 hours on the 23rd of May, in ice fog and poor light, her radar operators picked up a contact. Two large ships bearing roughly 340 degrees, range approximately 7 nautical miles. They had found them. What happened immediately after that contact is documented in HMS Suffolk's log, archived at kbismarck.com. And it's a sequence of events that rewards careful reading. The contact report was transmitted almost immediately. Rear Admiral Wake Walker, commanding the cruiser force from HMS Norfolk, received it and began closing to visual range. The B-Dienst Radio Intelligence Unit aboard Prinz Eugen, the German fleet's operational signals intelligence capability, intercepted Suffolk's contact report within minutes. The fleet commander knew he had been found. His response, recorded in the Atlantic Operation Report, was to maintain course and speed and order Prinz Eugen forward to lead the formation. He did not turn back. He did not try to disengage through the ice. He pressed on south into the Atlantic, with two British heavy cruisers now in contact astern of him. It's a decision that the post-battle analysis discusses at some length, without quite reaching a definitive conclusion about why he made it. The most charitable reading is that he still believed the home fleet was in Scapa, and that two cruisers, however well equipped, couldn't stop him. The less charitable reading is that the options for turning back had already narrowed past the point where they felt viable. I find it genuinely striking, when I cross-reference the German and British accounts of the next several hours, how different the same situation looked from each side of the water. From the German perspective, as reconstructed in the Atlantic Operation Report, the British cruisers were a nuisance, shadowing from a safe distance, transmitting contact reports, but unable to do more than mark position. The radar the British were using was, to the German fleet commander, a revelation. He had expected to be able to lose shadowers in fog and darkness, and instead found that every course change and speed adjustment was tracked and reported. His own report to Group North, transmitted at 0401 to 0443 hours on the 25th of May, noted with what sounds in translation like genuine surprise that the British radar worked perfectly at great distances in conditions that should have been opaque. From the British perspective, the question was simpler and more immediate. Stay in contact, don't get shot, and keep reporting. That's what Suffolk and Norfolk did. They kept reporting. The misidentification that German radio intelligence made during this period is one of those details that tends to get lost in the operational narrative, but is, I think, disproportionately important. The B-Dienst unit aboard Prinz Eugen was intercepting British tactical radio traffic throughout the Denmark Strait passage and attempting to identify the ships involved from their call signs. They concluded, based on their analysis, that one of the contact ships was HMS King George V, a battleship, not a cruiser. The Atlantic Operation Report is explicit about this. It states that the intelligence service aboard Prinz Eugen believed that it could also identify the King George as the contact ship. In reality, King George V was more than 300 nautical miles away. The ships maintaining contact were both heavy cruisers. This error, confusing a cruiser's call sign with a battleship's, fed directly into Lutyens' subsequent decision-making about which route to take to port.
If he believed King George V was already in his immediate vicinity, turning back through the Denmark Strait meant sailing toward her. The logical choice, given that misreading, was to press on toward France. When I read the sequence of events between the 21st and 23rd of May, the Gotland observation, the Bergen reconnaissance, the Iceland dispositions, the Suffolk radar contact, what strikes me most is how many individual links in the chain had to hold simultaneously for the British to maintain the intelligence advantage they had built. The Gotland captain had to be in the right place and file his report. The RAF crews had to successfully photograph the right fjords on a night when visibility was marginal. The Admiralty had to correctly interpret empty anchorages as evidence of departure rather than planned absence. Suffolk's radar had to work as advertised in conditions that would have defeated older equipment. Any one of these links failing, and the subsequent story unfolds very differently. All of them held. But it's worth noting that even with all of them holding, the British picture was still imperfect. Tovey didn't know for certain which passage the Germans would use, which is why he split his force. The intelligence success of this period was real. It was also narrow. By the evening of the 23rd of May, HMS Norfolk had opened fire on Bismarck. Briefly, at extreme range, when the German battleship turned toward her unexpectedly in the fog. The shells fell short. The British cruisers fell back to their shadowing distance and kept reporting. And in the Denmark Strait, between the Greenland ice pack to the north and the Iceland coast to the south, two forces were now on a course that would bring them to battle before dawn. The ice was close on the starboard side of the German formation, close enough that the navigating officers were using radar to track the ice edge. The air was cold in the particular way that Arctic air is cold, not the wet cold of the North Sea, but something drier and more absolute. And somewhere ahead, closing at full speed in the dark, were HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales. Hood's captain had received the contact reports. He knew where they were. He had his orders. Chapter 4. Admiral Holland's Angle. The Geometry of Catastrophe. The 24th of May, 1941. 0300 hours. The bridge of HMS Hood, somewhere in the northern Atlantic, steaming northwest at 27 knots to intercept a contact that the cruisers have been marking for the better part of 12 hours. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland has the plot in front of him. He can see where the German formation is. He can see where his own force is. He can calculate, with reasonable precision, where they will meet and when. What the plot cannot show him, what no plot ever shows, is the interior of the situation. The way the numbers will look when they stop being numbers and start being events. Hood is the largest warship Britain has ever built, 42,000 tons fully loaded, the embodiment of a particular idea about what naval power means. Prince of Wales, her consort, is so new that she has Vickers civilian workers still aboard, trying to fix quadruple-gun turret mechanisms that have been jamming in testing. They are going into action with a ship that isn't finished. Holland knows this. He doesn't have a choice about it. The approach geometry that Holland chose for the Denmark Strait engagement is the central technical mystery of the whole event, studied by 3 separate boards of inquiry and debated by naval historians for more than 80 years without reaching settled consensus. What is documented is this. Holland ordered both ships to approach the German formation at an angle of roughly 20 degrees of convergence, a course designed to close the range as rapidly as possible. The tactical logic was real and defensible. Hood's deck armor, over her midship magazines, was relatively thin by 1941 standards, roughly 50 to 76 millimeters in the most critical areas. At long range, shells arrive at steep angles of descent, plunging fire, and thin deck armor offers poor resistance. The faster Holland could close the range, the flatter the trajectory of incoming shells would be, and the better Hood's heavy belt armor, which ran to 305 millimeters in the thickest section, could protect her. The argument for closing fast was real, but closing fast on a converging course meant presenting only the forward 2 turrets to bear on the enemy. 4 guns out of 8. Bismarck could bring all 4 turrets, all 8 15-inch guns, to bear from the moment she turned toward him. In ADM 116/4352, the second Board of Inquiry into Hood's loss, the records of which are accessible through the HMS Hood website archive, there is a hand-drawn diagram of the approach. Someone has annotated it with a bearing notation, and next to the bearing there is a small question mark, written in what appears to be a different hand from the rest of the document. That question mark is, I think, the most honest thing in the entire file. The board was trying to determine who had ordered the approach angle and on what basis, and the evidence they had was fragmentary. Holland and his flag captain were both dead. Prince of Wales' captain survived but had limited visibility into Hood's command decisions, and the 3 Hood survivors had been on the exposed upper decks rather than at the command positions where these decisions were made. The inquiry could reconstruct the geometry. It could not reconstruct the reasoning. Holland's 6-minute signal, ordering both ships to alter course 40 degrees to port, turning them onto a bearing that would have brought their full broadsides to bear, was transmitted at approximately 05:37 hours. The timing suggests he was already correcting the approach angle, already moving to maximize his firepower. The signal arrived too late for it to matter. Before the turn could be completed, Bismarck had found Hood. The Prince Eugen's gunnery report, cross-referenced in the Atlantic Operation Report, states that British fire at the opening of the engagement was directed at the leading German ship, which was Prinz Eugen, not Bismarck. Holland's orders had specified that Hood should target the second ship, Bismarck, identified by position. Somehow, in the fog and the early light and the business of action stations, Hood's main battery director was aimed at the wrong target for the first minutes of the engagement. The Board of Inquiry records show that this misidentification was acknowledged by surviving officers from Prince of Wales. Whether it was a communication failure, a visual identification error, or something else remains contested. The Prince Eugen fire that struck Hood in the early minutes of the engagement is a detail that tends to be absorbed into the larger story without being fully examined. The Atlantic Operation Report's description of the battle notes that Prince Eugen's salvos, 20.3 centimeter shells, lighter than Bismarck's, but accurate, hit Hood in the region of the aft superstructure or aircraft hangar area and caused a fire that was visible from both German ships. This fire, almost certainly aviation fuel from Hood's floatplane facilities, burned at the base of the aft mast for several minutes before the fatal detonation. Now, the question of whether this fire contributed to the final explosion is genuinely unresolved. The official investigation focused primarily on the Bismarck shell and the magazine, but it's at least possible, and some post-war analysts have argued this more forcefully than the official inquiry did, that the Prinz Eugen hits weakened the magazine sealing or ignited ready-use ammunition in a handling room in a way that made the subsequent catastrophe more immediate than it might otherwise have been. The fire was real. What it did inside the ship is a question the archive cannot fully answer. At 0601 hours on the 24th of May, something happened that was over before most of the men aboard either ship had time to register it. A salvo from Bismarck. She had fired 93 rounds of heavy artillery during the entire engagement, per the German record, struck Hood in the area of the aft magazines. The specific mechanics of what followed are the subject of the most extensive naval investigation in British history. The most widely accepted conclusion is that an armor-piercing shell penetrated the deck and detonated in the magazine handling room, igniting the 4-inch ready-use cordite, which in turn initiated the main propellant magazines. The Bismarck's 38-centimeter Panzergranate shell, fired at a range of approximately 17,000 meters, arrived at a calculated angle of descent of roughly 12 degrees. Hood's main deck armor over the magazine was approximately 76 millimeters. Her inner deck below that was 38 millimeters. The German shell needed to penetrate 114 millimeters of deck protection to reach the cordite. The German shell's calculated penetration against horizontal armor at that range was approximately 300 millimeters. The physics were not in Hood's favor from the moment the approach angle was fixed. I have read the 3 boards of inquiry into Hood's loss more carefully than is probably good for a researcher's sleep patterns, and what I keep returning to is not any single technical finding, but the institutional pattern they reveal. Each board was constituted, investigated, and concluded, and each one arrived at slightly different assessments of the primary cause.
The first board emphasized magazine explosion from a direct penetrating hit. The second introduced the possibility of flash ignition through a damage control door left open. The third, reconvened with additional evidence, broadly endorsed the first board's conclusion while acknowledging residual uncertainty. What none of the three boards addressed directly, and what I think deserves to be said plainly, is the tactical decision that placed Hood in the firing position she was in. The geometry of the approach is visible in every diagram. The consequence of that geometry, 4 guns bearing instead of 8, the ship presenting its most vulnerable aspect to the enemy, is apparent in the outcome. The boards weren't convened to evaluate tactical decisions. They were convened to determine cause of loss. Those are different questions, and the difference protected certain conclusions from scrutiny. The ballistic performance data for the German 38cm SKC/34 gun is archived and available. The muzzle velocity of the standard armor-piercing shell was approximately 820 meters per second. The projectile weighed 800 kilograms. At 17,000 meters, the time of flight was approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds during which the shell was traveling in an arc that brought it down onto Hood's deck at an angle that defeated her protection. This is not supposition. These are the physics of the weapon. They were known to British naval intelligence before the war. The combination of Hood's deck armor thickness and Bismarck's likely engagement ranges had been assessed before the conflict. The assessment that Hood would be vulnerable to plunging fire at ranges above approximately 18,000 meters was not a post-war revelation. It was a pre-war calculation. The question of why Holland closed at an angle that maximized time at long range, exposing Hood to exactly the threat she was known to be most vulnerable to, is the question the boards didn't ask. I'm not sure history has answered it satisfactorily either. By 0613 hours on the 24th of May, HMS Prince of Wales had turned away under smoke. She had scored 3 hits on Bismarck. We'll examine what those hits actually did in the following chapter, because they matter enormously. But she was taking fire herself. Her turret systems were jamming, and with Hood gone, Captain Leach made the decision to disengage. The engagement lasted 21 minutes. In 21 minutes, the largest warship Britain had ever built ceased to exist, and a new battleship that wasn't yet properly operational fired her guns in anger for the first time, scored 3 hits that would prove more consequential than anyone realized, and then withdrew. From the German perspective, this was a triumph. The Atlantic Operation Report's summary of the engagement is precise about the ammunition expenditure. 93 rounds of heavy artillery from Bismarck, 179 from Prinz Eugen, and precise about the results. A battlecruiser destroyed, a battleship damaged and retreating, 2 cruisers maintaining contact but unable to engage. The passage to the Atlantic was open. The 3 survivors of HMS Hood were in the water for somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes. The accounts differ on this point, and I want to be honest about that discrepancy rather than pick the number that tells a cleaner story. Able seaman Robert Tilburn, midshipman William Dundas, and signal boy Ted Briggs. 18 years old, several of them, or near enough. They were on the exposed upper decks when the ship went, not inside the hull, which is why they survived when everyone below them did not. The pressure wave from the magazine explosion, so destructive in enclosed spaces, had thrown them clear of the hull rather than trapping them inside it. HMS Electra reached their position quickly and recovered all 3. The sea around them contained debris, but not many men in the water. 1,415 crew members had been aboard. 3 were in the ocean. The others were gone so completely that the question of where they were barely made sense to ask. Chapter 5. 3 Men in the Water. The 24th of May, 1941. The North Atlantic. Approximately 63 degrees north, 28 degrees west. The sea temperature at that latitude in late May is somewhere between 12 and 14 degrees Celsius, cold enough to begin incapacitating an unprotected person within 30 to 60 minutes. Cold enough that the body's priorities shift immediately from swimming to conserving core heat. Cold enough that the water you've fallen into feels less like a medium and more like a fact. Ted Briggs was on the compass platform, the flag bridge, one of the highest points of exposed working deck on the ship, when it happened. In his memoir, published in 1985, he described the moment with the specific clarity that survivors sometimes find years later. He was watching the enemy,
And the sea was greenish-gray, and then everything was black and vertical.
When he surfaced, he was already well clear of where the ship had been. The ship was not there. He was alive, and he did not, in that first minute, understand why. The physics of why 3 men survived when more than 1,400 did not is not a matter of luck alone, though luck was certainly present. It's a matter of geometry and atmospheric dynamics. The detonation of Hood's aft magazine was not a slow event. It was instantaneous in the way that only high-order explosives can be instantaneous. The kind of event where the interval between normal and catastrophic is too small to be measured by human perception. In enclosed spaces throughout the ship, the overpressure pulse from the detonation was lethal on its own terms, without any secondary flooding or structural collapse. Men at their action stations below decks didn't have time to react because there was no interval in which reaction was possible.
The 3 survivors were on the open upper deck, in positions where the pressure differential was survivable. The blast dissipated vertically and outward, rather than building in an enclosed volume. Tilburn was on the boat deck. Dundas was on the bridge. Briggs was on the flag bridge. All 3 were places where the atmosphere could move. This is why they lived. Everyone else was somewhere else. What strikes me about Briggs' account, and this is the detail that stays with me long after the operational analysis has settled, is a single specific observation he makes about the water. He describes it tasting of oil. Not the general saltiness of the Atlantic, but the specific taste of heavy fuel oil, the kind of naval distillate that Bismarck had been trailing in a visible slick since Prince of Wales's hit on the bow. The oil was in the water around him. It was in his mouth. This is not a detail that a writer invents to add atmosphere. It's a detail that emerges from a specific experience of a specific substance in a specific place. The archive record can tell you where ships were and what shells weighed. It can tell you the meteorological conditions and the fuel consumption rates. What it can't preserve is what the water tasted like when you were in it. And that fact is itself a kind of knowledge, a reminder that the events we reconstruct from paper were made of something more than paper. The debris field that surrounded the 3 survivors was, by all accounts, extensive, but not populated with living men. HMS Electra, the destroyer tasked with rescue operations, arrived quickly. The operational timeline suggests she reached the position within approximately 30 to 40 minutes of the sinking, though the survivor accounts give slightly different impressions of how long they were in the water, and I'd rather acknowledge that uncertainty than collapse it artificially. What Electra found was wreckage, small pieces, the kind of debris that a large, sudden catastrophe produces. Nothing that looked like it had once been the largest warship in the Royal Navy. A 5-meter section of bow had floated briefly and then gone under. There were no other survivors. Electra searched for a period. The sea gave nothing more back. The signal that reached the Admiralty in the hours after 0600 hours on the 24th of May was, by the standards of the naval communications of that period, as direct as such communications could be. Hood sunk. 2 words. These were transmitted through cruiser channels and relayed through operational communications to London, and they landed in the Admiralty War Room with a weight that those 2 words, in their brevity, inadequately convey. Winston Churchill's response in the immediate period is preserved in later memoir accounts rather than contemporaneous records. The diaries and communications from that specific morning are not entirely clear on the sequence of his reactions. What is clear from the Admiralty War Diary is that the operational response was rapid and comprehensive. Within hours, every available British warship within strategic range had received or was receiving new orders. Bismarck was to be intercepted and destroyed, regardless of the cost. The operational logic was real. She had just demonstrated what she could do against the best the Royal Navy had. But the emotional logic was real too, and in this particular case, they ran in exactly the same direction. Robert Tilburn was 18 years old. He had been in the Royal Navy less than 3 years when he found himself in the North Atlantic in 14-degree water with the ship he'd served on simply not existing anymore. He survived. He was back at sea after recovery and leave within weeks. The official record gives him a notation, a survivor's entry, a subsequent service history. What it doesn't give him is the space that Müllenheim-Reckberg, the senior surviving German officer, would later have: the memoir, the interviews, the commemorations, the status of authoritative witness. Tilburn's account is briefer in the record, less elaborated, less institutionally preserved. He outlived Ted Briggs, who died in October 2008 as the last surviving witness to the destruction of HMS Hood. Tilburn's own death passed with less public acknowledgement than Briggs. This is not an indictment of anyone. It is a straightforward observation about how rank and connection to institutional memory shapes whose experience gets preserved in forms that last. The Admiralty's operational response to Hood's sinking assembled, within hours, one of the largest concentrations of British naval force since Jutland. HMS King George V, Tovey's flagship, was already at sea. HMS Victorious, a newly commissioned carrier with an air group that had barely worked up to operational proficiency, was in company. HMS Prince of Wales, damaged but operational, continued shadowing. HMS Repulse, a battlecruiser, was redirected. Norfolk and Suffolk maintained their radar contact. And from Gibraltar, where Force H had been operating in the eastern Atlantic since the night of the 23rd, Vice Admiral Somerville began moving north with HMS Ark Royal, HMS Renown, and HMS Sheffield. 7 major warships, in addition to cruisers and destroyers, closing on a single German battleship across several hundred miles of North Atlantic. The response was, by any measure, overwhelming in scale. Whether it would be sufficient in time was a different question. The 3 survivors were brought aboard Electra, given dry clothes and hot food, and the particular hospitality that naval crews extend to people who have just been through something that has no adequate civilian equivalent. Briggs's memoir describes the immediate aftermath with characteristic specificity: the warmth of the mess deck, the faces of men who were sorry and didn't know what to say, the practical kindness of ordinary naval routine reasserting itself around the edges of something extraordinary. Dundas and Tilburn were there too. 3 men, from a crew of more than 1,400, sitting in a warm space on a destroyer that was still moving, still part of an operation that had not ended just because the flagship had. The sea outside was the same temperature it had been at 0600 hours. The oil slick was still there, visible in the water, marking a position that the navigator's charts would record with coordinates and the families of the dead would never be able to visit. HMS Hood had served the Royal Navy since 1920, commissioned as the largest and most powerful warship of her era, and never fully modernized in the ways that the naval architects who looked at her plans had always known she needed. The Great War experience that had shaped her designers had produced a ship optimized for belt armor and gun power, with deck protection that reflected 19-teens thinking about engagement ranges. By 1941, the engagement ranges had changed. The shells flew further, arrived steeper, and the deck armor that had been adequate for one era was thin for another. None of this was secret. It had been assessed, calculated, and noted in the naval planning documents of the 1930s. The modernization had been scheduled, and then deferred, and then scheduled again, and then deferred again, because there were always more pressing demands on the dockyard capacity and the appropriations budget. The war had started before the modernization could happen, and on the 24th of May, 1941, the consequence of that deferral was measured in 1,415 names and the specific taste of oil in the North Atlantic. By midday on the 24th of May, the signals traffic that the British Admiralty was processing presented a picture of great operational urgency and considerable uncertainty. Bismarck was southeast of the Denmark Strait, heading generally south or southwest, damaged to an unknown degree by Prince of Wales' 3 hits.
still accompanied by Prinz Eugen, still being tracked by Norfolk and Suffolk. Hood was gone. Prince of Wales had withdrawn. The pursuing force, Tovey's group, Force H from Gibraltar, the shadowing cruisers, was a powerful combination on paper, but it was spread across a wide area of ocean, operating at different speeds, under different commands, and connected by radio links that were not always reliable.
The German fleet commander knew his route. The British commanders were calculating probabilities. Somewhere to the south, in waters that would stay light for another several hours, Bismarck was making her speed for France. And the question of whether the British could close that gap before she reached the protective umbrella of Luftwaffe air cover over the Bay of Biscay was one that nobody in the Admiralty, at that particular moment, could answer with confidence.
Chapter 6. The Fuel That Changed Everything. Prince of Wales, 3 hits. The 24th of May, 1941, 06:13 hours. The smoke from HMS Hood's position is still in the air. HMS Prince of Wales, Captain John Leach commanding, Vickers civilian engineers still aboard trying to fix quadruple-gun turrets that have been jamming since the ship left port, has now been trading shells with both Bismarck and Prinz Eugen for approximately 20 minutes. She has taken hits. Her upper works are damaged. One of her turrets is temporarily out of action. The civilian workers are below decks, technically present on a warship that has just watched the largest vessel in the Royal Navy disappear in a column of smoke and debris. Leach is assessing, in real time and under fire, whether to continue engaging or to disengage, and by 06:13 he has made his decision: withdraw under smoke. Before he does, Prince of Wales gets off 3 hits, 3 out of a total of 9 salvos fired. In those 3 hits, particularly the last one, or perhaps the second, the accounts disagree on the sequence, will prove to be the most consequential shells fired by any British warship in the entire 8-day operation. The German record of the hits is more precise than the British, which is one of those archival inversions that you encounter occasionally, and that tells you something about the institutional culture of the people keeping the records. The Atlantic Operation Report states that Bismarck received 2 heavy hits during the Denmark Strait engagement. One in section 13 to 14, causing failure of electric plant number 4 and flooding in port boiler room number 2, which was held back, and one in the forecastle, sections 20 to 21, where the projectile entered port side, exiting starboard above the armored deck, oil cells hit. A third hit was noted as striking a boat with no tactical consequence. 5 men were lightly wounded. Maximum speed was reduced to 28 knots. Water was entering the forecastle. Oil cells were hit. That phrase, oil cells hit, is doing enormous quiet work in this document. The oil cells that were hit were forward fuel storage cells, and they were now mixing seawater with naval fuel oil in a proportion that made the contaminated mixture unusable in Bismarck's boilers. The engineering mechanics of what happened inside those forward sections deserve more attention than they typically receive in the popular accounts, which tend to describe the hit as causing an oil leak and then move on. What actually happened, and Korvettenkapitän Gerhard Unach's post-war account, The Last Hours of the Bismarck, published in the German Naval Archive and accessible at kbismarck.com, is the most authoritative source on the ship's internal condition, was more complex than a simple leak. A 14-inch shell from Prince of Wales hit the port bow at or near the waterline. The armor in that area was approximately 25 millimeters of outer hull plating. This was well forward of the main armor belt, which began amidships. A 14-inch projectile at battle range passes through 25 millimeters of hull plating without difficulty. The shell's entry into the hull generated a hydrostatic pulse, a sudden pressure wave inside the fluid-filled cellular structure of the forward oil tanks that ruptured internal baffles and destroyed the watertight integrity of multiple cells simultaneously. The result wasn't a hole in one place. It was a structural failure across a section. Unach's account and the Atlantic Operation Report diverge on a specific and important point about what happened next, and I want to be precise about this disagreement rather than smooth it over.
The Atlantic Operation Report states that a collision mat was raised over the shell holes in the forecastle, and that this could not prevent oil from seeping through from the damaged fuel cells, but implies the flooding was partially controlled. Junak's memoir states that the collision mats were torn free during the high-speed evasion maneuvers and torpedo attack avoidance on the night of the 24th to 25th of May, specifically during the attack by Swordfish aircraft from HMS Victorious, and that after they tore, the forward flooding was never re-established as manageable. If Junak is correct, and his position as senior engineering officer throughout the entire sequence gives him the best available technical authority on this specific question, then the damage was effectively uncontrolled from the moment of the hit. The official German report may have had institutional reasons to present the damage control effort in a more favorable light. The engineer's account may be more accurate about what the sea was actually doing to the bow. When I was working through the fuel consumption table in the Atlantic Operation Report, a clean, formal tabulation that runs through the operations timeline, I found the entries compelling in a very specific way. The table is precise until it isn't. Up to 0800 hours on the 24th of May, the numbers are clean. Calculated consumptions, known rates, specific figures. The entry for the estimated fuel stock on the morning of the 24th shows approximately 5,100 cubic meters, with the word rounded appearing once in the source. Rounded. Every other figure in the table is given to the last 100 cubic meters. That single word represents the moment when the engineering staff stopped being able to measure precisely, because the fuel level in the forward cells was changing too rapidly. Oil flowing out through the damaged structure, seawater flowing in to replace it, for a reliable reading to be taken. Someone had stopped trusting the instruments. When the instruments become untrustworthy, the commander's operational freedom narrows in direct proportion to the uncertainty. The fuel calculation that Group West made in the hours after the Denmark Strait battle is laid out in the Atlantic Operation Report, with the kind of careful retrospective arithmetic that planning staffs produce when they're trying to understand how a situation reached the point it did. The calculation worked like this: 7,700 cubic meters aboard at departure on the 18th of May, minus the consumption at various speeds over the subsequent days, minus an estimated battle damage loss. The result was a fuel state that, in theory, allowed for the passage to Saint-Nazaire with margin. But the calculation was based on estimated losses from the battle damage. The actual loss was larger, contamination included. Luton's signal at 20:56 hours on the 24th, due to fuel will proceed directly to Saint-Nazaire, confirms that the actual situation had overtaken the theoretical calculation. The freedom to choose a route had been replaced by the arithmetic of what fuel remained. He wasn't sailing toward France because he wanted to. He was being hydraulically compelled in that direction by a hole in his bow. The three Prince of Wales hits occupy an interesting position in the historiography of the Bismarck operation, because they're simultaneously well-documented and structurally undervalued. They appear in all the accounts. They're in the German record, the British record, the post-war analyses, but they tend to be treated as damage that complicated Bismarck's operation, rather than damage that determined its outcome. I think this is wrong. The first hit, in section 13 to 14, was damaging but not decisive. It flooded a boiler room and reduced power output, but the flooding was manageable. The second hit, in the forecastle sections, was the determinative event of the entire 8-day operation. Without it, Bismarck had fuel options. She could choose a route. She could try to disengage through the Denmark Strait, or to wait in the mid-Atlantic for the British pursuit to thin out. The forward hit removed those choices. It bled the ship toward France, the way a wound bleeds a person toward stillness. Prince of Wales herself is a remarkable figure in this story, and one I think is consistently underappreciated. She was so new that her gun turrets were jamming under operational conditions. The quadruple turrets of the 14-inch Mark VII gun were a novel design, and Vickers' workers had not yet resolved all the feed mechanism issues when the ship was ordered into action. Her main armament was not fully reliable. Yet, she scored 3 hits. The gunnery, despite the mechanical difficulties, was accurate. And the ship that scored those hits, that fired the shells that sealed Bismarck's fate before the first full day of the operation was over, would herself be sunk by Japanese land-based air attack off the coast of Malaya on the 10th of December 1941. She didn't survive long enough to understand what she'd done. The 3 hits were the most important thing HMS Prince of Wales ever did, and they happened in the first and last major naval engagement she was ever involved in. The oil trail that Bismarck left in her wake as she turned south from the Denmark Strait was visible, not subtle. A broad slick of heavy naval fuel, spreading and thinning as the sea diluted it, but present and trackable for as long as surface ships remained in the vicinity. Prinz Eugen dropped back at one point, specifically to observe and report on the trail's character. The Atlantic Operation Report records this observation and notes that the oil was widely visible. In good weather, from a shadowing ship or a coastal command aircraft, an oil trail is a navigational marker. It says, "Something large came this way, and it's bleeding." The British cruisers behind her could see it. The aircraft that would search for her in the coming days would be looking for it. The forward hit had done more than reduce Bismarck's fuel options. It had left a physical trace of her passage on the surface of the ocean, a trail that circumstances and distance would eventually erase, but that contributed to the intelligence picture in the critical hours after the Denmark Strait battle. By the afternoon of the 24th of May, the full consequences of Prince of Wales' 3 hits were not yet visible to anyone. Not to Lutyens, who was still calculating whether he could disengage from the shadowers, not to the Admiralty, who knew only that Bismarck had been hit without knowing precisely how badly, not to the planning staff at Group West in France, who were beginning to calculate the support they'd need to arrange for her arrival at Saint-Nazaire. What was visible, to everyone, was the position. Bismarck was heading south-southeast, trailing oil, no longer making the full 30 knots of her design speed, and with 2 British heavy cruisers still in contact astern. The passage to the Atlantic was open in a technical sense. The route to France was already being dictated by something smaller and more fundamental than strategy. It was being dictated by seawater entering a bow compartment at a rate that nobody aboard could precisely measure, mixing with the fuel that the ship's boilers needed to keep running, and draining away, slowly, continuously, irrecoverably, into the North Atlantic. Chapter 7. The Night Bismarck Disappeared. The Navigation Error That Almost Saved Her. The 25th of May, 1941. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, roughly 550 miles west-southwest of the Irish coast. The sky at this latitude in late May never fully darkens. It reaches a kind of gray twilight around midnight, and then begins lightening again toward 0200 hours, the kind of non-night that makes watchkeeping a strange, disorienting business. HMS Suffolk has been shadowing Bismarck continuously since the radar contact in the Denmark Strait the previous evening. For nearly 30 hours, her Type 271 radar has been the thread connecting the British pursuit force to its quarry. Bearing reports transmitted every few minutes, position updates relayed to Admiral Tovey aboard King George V, the whole intricate machinery of a naval pursuit running on the quiet electronic heartbeat of a rotating antenna and a man watching a screen. Then, sometime in the early hours of the 25th, the thread breaks. The screen shows nothing. Suffolk's radar is sweeping empty ocean. Bismarck is gone. The exact mechanism of contact loss has been debated in the naval literature more than almost any other single event in the operation, and I want to be honest about the state of the evidence before offering any interpretation. What is clear is that the loss occurred during a period when Bismarck made a course change, turning to investigate what her crew apparently believed was an ASDIC contact, possibly a submarine. The Atlantic Operation Report, reconstructing events from what could be recovered of the German side's records, notes a sharp turn to starboard sometime around 0300 hours. Suffolk was tracking from a position astern and to the side of Bismarck's course. During the turn, Bismarck moved through a bearing arc that placed her temporarily outside the effective coverage of Suffolk's antenna orientation, or behind the beam, at a moment when the radar watch was being handed over between watchkeepers. The manual plotting cycle on Suffolk, bearings updated by hand on a rolling chart table, not automatically, had a seam exactly there, at the watch change, where the continuity of the plot was most vulnerable. The technology was good. The human interface with the technology had a gap in it. Contact was lost in that gap. The Admiralty's response to the contact loss was immediate and, it turned out, catastrophically wrong in its initial direction. Direction-finding stations around Britain had been monitoring Bismarck's radio transmissions throughout the operation, and when Lütjens transmitted a lengthy signal to Group West at approximately 0401 to 0443 hours on the 25th, a transmission that covered the tactical situation, the fuel state, his intentions, and his assessment of British radar capabilities, multiple shore-based DF stations obtained bearings. The procedure from there was standard. The bearings were transmitted to the Admiralty Operational Intelligence Center in London, plotted on the large chart table, and combined to produce a position estimate. It was at this plotting stage that something went wrong. The precise nature of the error has been the subject of considerable historiographical attention. Rhys-Jones addresses it in his analysis. The Admiralty's own internal post-action review touched on it. And the most widely accepted explanation is that a bearing expressed in true north terms was applied to the chart as though it were a magnetic bearing, or vice versa, producing a plotting error of somewhere between 9 and 11 degrees. In the open Atlantic, at the ranges involved, 9 to 11 degrees of bearing error translates to a positional error of more than 100 miles. 100 miles in the wrong direction is not a small navigational mistake. It is the difference between knowing where your target is and not knowing at all. The plotted position from the corrupted DF fix placed Bismarck on a heading toward the northeast, toward Iceland, toward Norway, back the way she had come. Admiral Tovey, receiving this assessment from the Admiralty, turned his force northeast to intercept. He was sailing away from Bismarck. Every knot of speed he made in the wrong direction increased the separation between his force and the German battleship, which was at that moment moving southeast toward France at between 22 and 24 knots. The 6 hours that followed were, from the perspective of the German side, the closest Bismarck came to survival after the Denmark Strait battle. She was untracked, unhunted, moving freely across an ocean that had briefly stopped looking for her. What I find genuinely remarkable when I cross-reference the British and German accounts of this period is how differently the same interval of freedom appeared from each side. From the German perspective, or at least from what can be reconstructed of it, given that the ship's war diary is gone, Lütjens appears to have believed he was still being tracked. His early morning transmission, the one that inadvertently gave the British their DF fix, was apparently sent because he was operating on the assumption that his position was already known to the enemy. The Atlantic Operation Report notes his conclusion, drawn from the previous night's experience, that British radar devices worked perfectly over long distances, and that evasion from the shadowers was effectively impossible. He was wrong about this. By the time he transmitted, he had been free for at least an hour. He broke radio silence to report a situation that, in terms of contact, had already changed. The transmission that was supposed to inform his commanders about the tactical situation instead told the British where to look, once the direction-finding error was corrected. The correction came from Gibraltar. A shore-based direction-finding station at the southern end of Europe, positioned to cover the eastern Atlantic approaches, provided a second long-range bearing on the same transmission. When an analyst at the Admiralty, the records don't preserve the name of the individual, compared the Gibraltar bearing with the earlier plotted fix, the inconsistency was immediately apparent. A ship on the course suggested by the original plot could not have produced a Gibraltar bearing at the angle shown. The two lines, drawn on the chart, pointed to very different ocean areas. It took time to work through the implications, to accept that the original plot had been wrong, and to transmit a revised assessment to Tovey. By the time the correction reached him and he reversed course, approximately 6 hours had elapsed. 6 hours at 22 knots is roughly 132 nautical miles of separation. Bismarck was 132 miles closer to France than she would have been if the error had never occurred.
that margin would prove almost sufficient.
When I was working through the timeline of May 25th and cross-referencing it with the fuel consumption tables and the position estimates on both sides, what struck me most forcefully was the cascading nature of the errors on both sides. The British made a DF plotting mistake. The Germans made a radar assessment error, believing they were still tracked when they weren't. Lutyens then transmitted a long radio message at the wrong time, which gave the British a fresh DF fix to correct their earlier error. Each mistake created the conditions for the next correction. If Lutyens had maintained radio silence, the DF plotting error would never have been corrected with fresh data. If the Admiralty plotter hadn't made the initial error, Tovey wouldn't have turned northeast, and there would have been no 6-hour window of separation for Force H to close from the south. The operation's resolution depended on a specific sequence of errors and corrections that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted. Ensign Leonard B. Smith of the United States Navy was, on the 26th of May, 1941, officially the co-pilot aboard a Catalina flying boat of 209 Squadron, RAF Coastal Command, flying from Castle Archdale in Northern Ireland on an anti-submarine patrol. The United States was not at war. The fiction of his co-pilot status was maintained because American naval personnel participating directly in combat operations against German forces would have constituted an act of war by a neutral nation, something that the careful architects of the Atlantic relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt were managing with considerable diplomatic delicacy. His report, filed after the mission and archived at kbismarck.com, describes locating a large vessel at approximately 10:30 hours on the 26th. The vessel was Bismarck. His bearing report, in the dry language of operational aviation reporting, set in motion the final phase of the hunt. The report says what it says and nothing more. What it represents is something larger. An American naval officer actively flying combat reconnaissance missions against German warships 6 months before the United States formally entered the war. The hunt for the Bismarck is, in a small but specific way, the opening chapter of American co-belligerency in the Atlantic. The Catalina's report gave Force H, Somerville's group, which had been racing north from Gibraltar, the confirmation it needed. HMS Ark Royal, carrying the Swordfish torpedo squadrons that would become the decisive instrument of the operation, was now roughly 130 miles northwest of Bismarck's reported position and closing. HMS Sheffield was detached to establish visual contact in shadow. The picture was clarifying. But Bismarck was still making speed, still approximately 700 miles from Brest, and the window in which an airstrike from Ark Royal could be launched before the German battleship reached the protective range of Luftwaffe fighter cover was narrowing with every hour. The mathematics of speed and distance and aircraft range had converged on a specific patch of ocean and a specific window of time. 24 hours, maybe less. After that, the Luftwaffe could reach her. After that, no British surface ship could approach. The Catalina's bearing report had opened the window. Something would have to fly through it before it closed. By the evening of the 26th of May, the Admiralty's picture was the clearest it had been since contact was lost the previous morning. Bismarck was located, tracked by Sheffield, closing on the Bay of Biscay. Force H was in position to the north. Tovey's force, King George V and Rodney, which had joined the pursuit on a converging course, was closing from the northwest, but still too far to guarantee interception before Brest if Bismarck maintained speed. Everything now depended on the aircraft aboard Ark Royal. Not the aircraft of 1941's imagination, the fast monoplane fighters and torpedo bombers of a modern carrier. The actual aircraft available were Fairey Swordfish biplanes, fabric-covered, open cockpit, built to a 1933 design and flying at speeds that the pre-war RAF would have considered inadequate for training purposes. They were the instrument available. They were what had to be enough. At 7:30 in the evening, in winds that were gusting to 30 knots and seas building to 30 feet on the approach, 15 Swordfish were ranged on Ark Royal's deck. The carrier was pitching 56 feet from bow to stern. The flight deck was moving through the vertical equivalent of a 5-story building with each wave. The crews climbed into their cockpits. Chapter 8.
the string bag that changed the war. Swordfish against Bismarck. The 26th of May, 1941, 7:30 in the evening. HMS Ark Royal, somewhere in the North Atlantic, roughly 130 miles northwest of Bismarck's last confirmed position. The carrier is moving at full speed into the wind to generate enough deck airflow for the aircraft to get airborne, and the combination of her own 28 knots and the natural wind is producing approximately 45 knots across the flight deck, which would be useful information if the deck were level. It is not level. It is moving through an arc of roughly 56 feet with each wave, up and then down and then up again, at intervals of perhaps 12 seconds. The ground crew, bracing the Swordfish against the deck tie-downs, are watching the bow rise above the horizon and then plunge back toward the sea, and trying to time the release for the upswing. If you release on the downswing, the aircraft drops before it has enough airspeed. You release on the upswing and let the deck throw the aircraft upward into the wind. Several of the Swordfish are carrying Mark 12 18-inch aerial torpedoes, each weighing 610 kilograms. The aircraft itself, fully loaded, weighs just under 3,000 kilograms. It is taking off from a pitching steel deck in a 45-knot wind at sea, in the North Atlantic, in late May, on a strike mission against the most heavily armed warship in the German fleet, at roughly 90 knots. I want to deal with the obsolete biplane framing before we go further, because it shapes how this story is typically told, and I think it tells it wrong. The ferry Swordfish Mark I was designed in 1933 and entered service in 1936. By 1941, it was considered outdated by virtually every technical measure. Maximum airspeed approximately 138 knots under ideal conditions. Open cockpits. Fabric-covered wings. A fixed undercarriage that generated drag even in level flight. All of this is accurate, but the word obsolete implies that the aircraft was inadequate for its purpose, and on the evening of the 26th of May, the Swordfish was precisely adequate for its specific purpose in a way that no more modern aircraft would have been. Bismarck's anti-aircraft fire control system, the Schießleitanlage C/34, had a minimum target speed input for its ballistic solution of 100 knots. Below 100 knots, the fire control computer's solution was invalid, and the gunners had to resort to local control, aiming by eye, without the benefit of the director's ranging and rate calculations. The Swordfish was attacking at 87 to 90 knots. Every shell fired by Bismarck's anti-aircraft battery at those aircraft was fired without a valid fire control solution. The aircraft was slow in exactly the way that mattered. The first strike launched that evening did not attack Bismarck. This is the detail that tends to disappear in the popular accounts because it's embarrassing and because it didn't result in disaster, but it is operationally important. 14 Swordfish of 825 and 820 squadrons flew their search pattern through cloud and deteriorating visibility and acquired a surface contact. The contact was HMS Sheffield, which had been detached to shadow Bismarck, and which was, at that moment, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing in exactly the area where the strike aircraft expected to find a German battleship. 11 torpedoes were released. 7 of them detonated prematurely. The magnetic influence pistol fuses, which were supposed to trigger in response to a ship's magnetic field, were malfunctioning, probably due to the rough handling during the pitching deck launch. The remaining 4 passed within approximately 30 yards of Sheffield without hitting her. The crew of Sheffield, watching the attack from their own quarterdeck, took evasive action and then sent a signal reporting the incident. The signal's tone is described, in various accounts, as something between incredulous and extremely terse. No one on Sheffield was hurt. The operational near-miss was recovered from. The fact that it happened at all reveals the conditions under which the strike crews were operating. Cloud, poor visibility, an incomplete briefing about friendly forces, and a set of torpedo fuses that were performing unpredictably. The second strike was briefed with 2 specific corrections: contact fuses rather than magnetic pistols on all torpedoes, and Sheffield's position identified as a directional reference. The pilots were told to find Sheffield first and use her as a bearing marker to find Bismarck beyond her. 15 Swordfish were armed and launched into conditions that had deteriorated further since the first strike. The cloud base was lower, the sea was rougher, the deck was pitching harder. Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode, the strike leader, described in his after-action report flying through cloud at 100 feet above the ocean surface. 100 feet, in those conditions, with a torpedo slung under the fuselage, with his aircraft becoming separated from the rest of the strike group in the overcast. The attack as it developed was not the coordinated wave assault of the training manuals. It was a series of individual and small group attacks from multiple bearings, coming in at different angles at different moments in the darkness and spray of a North Atlantic evening. It was chaotic in the specific way that operational reality tends to be chaotic when it departs from the plan. What happened to Bismarck's anti-aircraft battery during those attacks is worth examining in technical detail, because it explains something that seems counterintuitive at first. That one of the most heavily armed warships in the world, surrounded by fabric and wire biplanes, failed to shoot down a single one of them during the attack itself. The ship's main anti-aircraft armament consisted of 16 10.5-centimeter guns in twin mounts, controlled by dedicated fire control directors with their own radar-assisted ranging. These systems required a target speed input. As already noted, the minimum valid input was 100 knots. Below that speed, the directors could not produce a ballistic solution, and the guns fell back to local control. The secondary anti-aircraft battery, 37mm and 20mm weapons, could engage at lower speeds, but lack the ranging accuracy of the director-controlled systems. In local control, in spray and darkness, against targets crossing at 87 knots from multiple directions, the gunners were doing the equivalent of calculating a moving intercept without instruments. Some aircraft were hit. None were brought down during the attack run. The technological edge in this specific encounter belonged, paradoxically, to the aircraft that had been dismissed as technologically backward. 2 torpedoes found Bismarck that evening, between approximately 20:47 and 21:15 hours. The first hit the ship amidships, in the area of the main armored belt. The Mark 12 torpedo carried a 176-kilogram Torpex warhead. The detonation against the main armor belt, 320 millimeters of Wotan Hart steel, produced flooding and casualties and a significant concussive effect on nearby machinery. But the armor held. The main belt was not penetrated. The first torpedo hit was damaging and not decisive. The second torpedo hit Bismarck in the stern, in the area of the steering gear compartment, in sections approximately 2 to 4 from the ship's after end. The plating in that area was approximately 15 to 20 millimeters, stern structure, not armored belt. The Torpex detonation in a lightly protected space generated an overpressure pulse that the naval architect's analysis from the NavWep's technical assessment describes as having vented directly into the rudder mechanism compartment. Both rudders were physically displaced from their operational positions by the hydraulic force of the blast. The hydraulic lines to the servo motors ruptured. The rudders jammed at approximately 12 degrees of port helm. Bismarck began turning to port and could not stop turning. It fascinates me how the central vulnerability in the entire system, the thin stern plating above the steering gear, the specific geometric position where a torpedo hit would be decisive rather than merely damaging, was not a secret weakness, not something that British intelligence had identified as a target and directed the strike crews toward. It was simply where the second torpedo happened to land. Coode's after-action report doesn't describe a planned precision attack on the steering gear. It describes an attack conducted in difficult conditions by a crew doing their job as trained, with the outcome shaped as much by the operational chaos of the night as by any specific tactical planning. The first torpedo could have hit the stern. The second could have hit the belt. The outcome, the jamming of both rudders, was the result of one specific hit in one specific place, and it was not inevitable. It happened, and because it happened, everything that followed was possible. The German engineering attempts to restore steering in the hours after the torpedo hit are described in Junak's account with the precision of a man who spent those hours personally trying to solve an engineering problem that could not be solved. 3 approaches were attempted. First, restoring hydraulic power to the Brown Bovary servo motors that controlled the rudder stocks. Impossible, because the hydraulic lines had ruptured in the explosion and the fluid had drained into the compartment and the sea. Second, attaching manual block and tackle systems to the rudder stalks to move them by hand. Physically impossible given the flooding in the steering compartment, the structural deformation from the blast, and the forces involved in trying to move 9-ton rudder assemblies against a 20-knot flow of water. Third, dropping the rudders entirely by detonating explosive charges on the pintles, the fittings that held the rudders to the ship's structure, which was attempted but failed because the charges required for this procedure were stored in the damaged aft compartment and were either inaccessible or damaged. Nothing worked. The ship spent her last night using differential shaft speeds, running the port and starboard propeller shafts at different revolutions to generate a steering moment, which could hold a rough course in calm conditions, and was inadequate in the 30-knot winds and heavy seas of that night. When I read Bismarck's transmitted messages from the evening of the 26th of May, the signals to Group West, to the commander-in-chief of U-boats, to the fleet command structure, the tone shifts in a way that doesn't require any particular sensitivity to detect. The earlier signals of the operation, even after the Denmark Strait battle, have the character of situation reports, tactical assessments from a commander managing a difficult but not hopeless situation. The signals of the evening of the 26th have a different register. Ship unmaneuverable. We fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. This is not a tactical report. It is a farewell in military uniform. Whether Lutyens wrote it himself or dictated it to a signals officer, whether the language was chosen deliberately or was the standard formula of such communications, the message contains a specific clarity about the situation that no amount of operational language can fully obscure. The ship could not be steered. The engineers had tried everything they could try. Somewhere to the northeast, closing through the night, were the British battleships that the morning would bring. By midnight on the 26th of May, HMS King George V and HMS Rodney were approximately 40 miles north of Bismarck's position, closing at maximum sustainable speed. Both ships had been at sea for days. Their crews were tired in the specific way that extended operations produce, the accumulation of watch cycles and alert stations, and the particular tension of a pursuit that keeps almost resolving and doesn't. Tovey had been ordered by the Admiralty to close for a dawn engagement, ideally to bring Bismarck under fire before the daylight that would make her visible to Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft operating from French bases. The margin was tight. 400 miles of ocean still separated Bismarck from Brest. She was making perhaps 7 knots in large circles, unable to hold a heading against the wind and sea. If she had been able to maintain 22 knots on a straight course, she would have been safe by morning. She could not maintain 22 knots on a straight course. The rudders held her in their 12-degree jam, and the sea pushed at her broadside, and she moved in the slow, constrained arc of a ship that has lost the most fundamental thing a ship can lose: the ability to go where it chooses. Chapter 9. The Longest Night. Destroyers and the Circle of Death. The 26th of May, 1941, 2300 hours. The North Atlantic. HMS Cossack is one of 5 destroyers of Captain Philip Vian's 4th Destroyer Flotilla. Tribal class, 1,870 tons standard displacement, 4.7-inch guns, capable of 36 knots in calm conditions and something considerably less in the seas that are running tonight. The bridge is wet. It has been wet for hours. The spray comes over the bow at irregular intervals, and the watch officer has given up wiping his binoculars. By the time he gets them clear, they're wet again. Below decks, the ship moves in the particular way that destroyers move in heavy seas. Not the steady roll of a large ship, but a quicker, more complex motion, a combination of pitch and roll and yaw that the crew has learned to work with rather than against. Cossack is closing on a radar contact to the south. The contact is large. It's moving slowly, erratically, holding no consistent heading. It is Bismarck, and Bismarck has been circling in some approximation of the same patch of ocean for nearly 2 hours. Vian's orders for the night were, in operational terms, modest. Make torpedo attacks if practicable, maintain contact, delay and harass the German formation until the battleships could arrive at dawn.
The emphasis was on contact and delay rather than destruction. Tovey was not expecting his destroyers to sink Bismarck, and the tactical reality of torpedo attacks at night in heavy seas against a ship with a still functional heavy armament made any expectation of decisive results unrealistic. What the destroyers could do, and did, was prevent the German crew from resting. The secondary battery of Bismarck, the 15-centimeter guns, controlled by their own directors, tracking by radar, fired continuously throughout the night whenever the destroyers closed to attack range. The engagement was maintained for approximately 5 hours, from around 2300 hours to approximately 0300 hours. In those 5 hours, the German gun crews were at action stations. The engineering staff were at action stations trying to manage the flooding and the steering. The bridge team were attempting to hold some semblance of consistent heading through differential shaft control. Nobody aboard Bismarck slept on the night of the 26th into the 27th of May. HMS Cossack's War Diary for the night attack records torpedo runs at approximately 23:42, 01:21, and 02:42 hours. After each run, the entry reads, "Results uncertain," or similar language, the standard formulation for a night torpedo attack where observation of the target through spray and darkness was incomplete. This archival reticence is honest, and I want to credit it as such, rather than reading it as evasion. Night torpedo attacks in Force 5 to 6 C conditions, against a target using its secondary battery and local control, with spray reducing visibility to intermittent, were not the conditions under which you could observe results with confidence. What the War Diary cannot tell you, and what the German survivor accounts suggest, without being explicit enough to settle the question, is whether any of those torpedoes found the ship. Mullenheim-Reckberg's memoir describes additional flooding in the stern area during the night. The Atlantic Operation Report, compiled without access to the ship's own war diary, is less specific about what happened below decks during the destroyer attacks. The arithmetic of 16 torpedoes fired from multiple attack runs at a near-stationary target, producing 0 confirmed hits, requires either exceptional German luck or conservative British record-keeping, possibly both, possibly neither. HMS Zulu's attack at approximately 01:21 hours produced the most specific claim of the night. Lieutenant Commander Graham reported, in his after-action record, observing what he described as a column of water and smoke at the target's stern position shortly after torpedo release. This language occupies a careful space between claiming a hit and not claiming one. It describes a visual observation without asserting a causal relationship between the torpedo and the phenomenon observed. Naval after-action reports are written by people who know that overclaiming is professionally damaging, and the formulation Graham chose reflects a watchfulness about that. The observation he describes is consistent with a torpedo detonation. It is also consistent with a near-miss detonation, a premature fuse activation, or a coincidental wave breaking in poor light. No post-war analysis has resolved which of these it was, and I suspect none will, given the evidence available. The star shell illuminations that several of Vion's ships conducted during the night attacks deserve a brief technical note, because they shaped what each side could see during the exchanges. A star shell round, fired from a 4.7-inch gun, produces approximately 800,000 candela of illumination at the burst point, roughly comparable to a large aircraft landing light, suspended above the target for the duration of its parachute descent. For the 12 to 15 seconds of good illumination, Bismarck was lit against the night Atlantic with considerable clarity. From the destroyer bridge, she looked enormous. A 600-foot battleship, still upright, still shooting, her secondary battery traversing toward the light source with the smooth deliberation of a mechanical system that has not yet been compromised. From Bismarck's perspective, the star shells put the attacking destroyers into visibility for the return fire, but the destroyers were moving fast and presenting difficult targets, and the heavy seas that made the destroyer attacks difficult also made the defensive fire unreliable. The exchanges were fierce and, in terms of damage inflicted, roughly inconclusive. What the night accomplished, and what I think tends to be undervalued in accounts that treat the destroyer engagement as a prelude to the real battle, was the complete exhaustion of Bismarck's crew before the dawn engagement. A crew that has been at action stations for 8 hours, in heavy weather, fighting off multiple torpedo attacks while simultaneously managing flooding and attempting to restore steering, arrives at a fleet engagement in a fundamentally different state than a crew that has rested. By 0300 hours on the 27th of May, Bismarck's crew had been continuously at action stations or in damage control postures for most of the preceding 24 hours. The torpedo hit had jammed the rudders approximately 9 hours before dawn. The destroyer attacks had begun 4 hours after that. There was no sleep to be had, no rest, no period in which the specific exhaustion of sustained action could be interrupted. This matters. It matters for fire control performance, for damage control response, for engineering decision-making, for the ability to do the specific, skilled tasks that keep a warship functioning under fire. Vian's flotilla didn't sink the ship. They helped ensure that the men defending it were running on empty when morning came. The signal from Bismarck that Lütjens transmitted in the late hours of the 26th, the formal valediction that closed with "Long live the Führer," reached its addressees and was acknowledged. What followed it, in terms of the German command response, was a determined effort to assemble some form of rescue. U-boats were ordered to the area. The destroyers Z-10 and Z-23 were dispatched from the French coast, though they were too far away to arrive before the morning's battle. Air support from French-based Luftwaffe units was requested. The Kriegsmarine did not abandon Bismarck. It simply couldn't reach her in time. The gap between the resources that were theoretically available and the time it took to deploy them was measured in the 650 miles that separated Bismarck from the French coast. The support that might have saved her, air cover, destroyers, submarine screen, required time that the arithmetic of the operation no longer provided. It fascinates me, in a melancholy way, that U-556's war diary entry for the 26th of May, archived at kbismarck.com, records its commander, Kapitänleutnant Herbert Wolfarth, watching both HMS Ark Royal and HMS Renown pass through his field of view at a range suitable for attack. He had no torpedoes. His war diary records this observation with the particular restraint of a military document that knows what it is describing. The operational patrol that had expended his weapons at Lorient overlapped, by a matter of days, with the operational patrol during which he could have changed the course of the engagement. Wolfarth was not to blame. He could not have known that Bismarck would need what he no longer had. But the entry in his war diary is the clearest expression in the entire primary record of how close the German side came, at multiple points, to a different outcome. A U-boat with torpedoes in the right place at the right moment. A tanker available for refueling at the right time. A Gneisenau that hadn't been bombed at Brest. The operation that was assembled from the available resources rather than the required ones. By 0300 hours on the 27th of May, Vian's destroyers had broken off their attacks, maintaining a shadowing distance as the sky began its slow lightening toward dawn. Bismarck was still there, still circling, still transmitting intermittently, still returning gunfire when the destroyers came too close. From the distance of a destroyer bridge, watching through binoculars in the pre-dawn gray, she looked formidable. The scale of the thing. The steadiness of the gun mounts when they fired, the way the shell splashes went up around the attacking ships in patterns that said the fire control was still partially functional. There was something about the ship's continued resistance, maintaining a defensive perimeter through the night, continuing to function despite everything that had been done to it, that several of the destroyer officers' later accounts describe with a kind of involuntary respect. This is one of those places where I want to be careful about the language. Respect for the engineering and the training that kept a damaged ship fighting through a night of attacks is not the same thing as approving of what that ship was or what it was doing there. But it is present in the accounts, and pretending it isn't would be dishonest about what the record shows. Dawn came to that patch of the North Atlantic at approximately 0500 hours on the 27th of May, 1941. The sky went from gray to pale. The sea, still running at force 5 to 6, was the color of pewter in the early light.
On the horizon to the north-northwest, HMS Rodney's silhouette was visible to those watching from Bismarck. That distinctive profile, the three triple 16-inch gun turrets arranged forward of the superstructure, the shape of a ship that had been designed to fight exactly this kind of fight. Behind her, slightly further off, HMS King George V. The destroyers had stepped back. The morning was here. There was nothing left of the night's business except the flooding in the stern, the rudders held at their 12-degree jam, the exhausted men at their stations, and the specific clarity of an early Atlantic morning that makes everything look both very close and very final. Chapter 10. The Kill. 0847 to 1036, May 27th. The 27th of May, 1941, 0847 hours. The light is full now, the kind of clear northern morning that gives excellent visibility for gunnery. HMS Rodney, 33,000 tons standard displacement, armed with 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, built in 1927 and showing her age in the slowness of her response to the helm, but not in the reach of her armament, opens fire at a range of approximately 25,000 yards, approximately 14 miles. At that range, a 16-inch shell is in flight for roughly 37 seconds. 37 seconds between the muzzle flash and the arrival. Rodney's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Hugh Guernsey, is watching through the director optics. His preliminary gunnery report, typed with handwritten amendments in the margins, archived at kbismarck.com, opens with a simple timetable. 0847, open fire. 0904, first straddle observed. Bismarck returns fire almost immediately. Her first salvos are not short or wide. They are close. They fall near Rodney in the first minutes of the engagement, close enough to send spray across her forward deck. For those first minutes, this is a battle, not an execution. The question of when Bismarck's return fire stopped being effective is one of the more significant analytical problems in the entire engagement, and the sources give somewhat different answers. Guernsey's gunnery report notes that Bismarck's forward turrets, Anton and Bruno, the two main battery turrets forward of the superstructure, ceased firing at approximately 0927 hours, roughly 40 minutes into the engagement. By around 0940, the after turrets were also silent. The standard interpretation is that progressive shell damage to the turret structure, the fire control systems, and the power supply had silenced the battery. This is almost certainly partially correct. But Mullenheim-Reckberg's memoir, written from his position in the aft fire control director, suggests a more complex picture, that some turrets were structurally intact but had lost their hydraulic power supply, leaving them physically unable to train and elevate even though the barrels themselves were undamaged. This distinction, silence by loss of power versus silence by structural destruction, matters because it bears on the subsequent question of the ship's internal condition at the time the scuttling was ordered. At approximately 0902 hours on the 27th of May, shell fire from the British battleships struck the bridge structure of Bismarck. The Atlantic Operation Report and the survivor accounts are consistent on this point. After this hit, all command signals from Bismarck ceased. The flag bridge, the Admiral's Station, and the navigating bridge were both destroyed. Fleet Commander Lutyens was, in all probability, killed at this moment. Captain Lindemann's fate is less certain in the record, though he is also believed to have been killed at or shortly after this time. Their bodies were never recovered. The formal deaths of the commanding officers of a capital ship, mid-battle, are recorded in the archives with the same bureaucratic understatement that characterizes the entire record. They simply stop appearing in the signals traffic. There's no last transmission, no recorded final order. The communications stop, and the silence is the evidence. By 0900 hours, HMS Norfolk had opened fire from the east, adding 8-inch shells to the 16-inch and 14-inch rounds that Rodney and King George V were pouring into the German ship. Bismarck was now being engaged from two compass directions. King George V and Rodney from the north-northwest, Norfolk from the east, and the combined fire was systematically dismantling her superstructure.
The secondary battery, the anti-aircraft mounts, the rangefinder directors, the communications systems, the fire control infrastructure that connected sensors to guns, all of it was being destroyed, one hit at a time, in the methodical way that sustained heavy-caliber fire demolishes the working systems of a warship while leaving the hull and the machinery spaces below the armored deck largely intact. This is the central technical reality of the final battle. The British guns were doing enormous damage to everything above the waterline and relatively little damage to the structure below it. The ammunition expenditure figures from the engagement are worth reading carefully, because they tell a story that the general accounts tend to gloss over. Rodney fired 380 rounds of 16-inch ammunition. King George V fired 339 rounds of 14-inch. Between them, that's 719 rounds of the heaviest naval gunfire available to the Royal Navy in 1941. Norfolk and Dorsetshire added several hundred 8-inch rounds. The cumulative weight of steel delivered into Bismarck during the 109 minutes of active firing was enormous. By any reasonable calculation, more than 2,500 tons of projectile metal. The ship absorbed this and remained afloat, structurally coherent below the waterline, colors still flying. This is not a criticism of British gunnery. It is a statement about the armor scheme that the Hamburg engineers had designed and built in the 1930s. The armor did what it was designed to do, up to the point where the men behind the guns ran out of reasons to fire them. I want to be precise about what happened in the engineering spaces during the final phase of the battle, because it's the part of the story where the evidence becomes most complicated and where the historiographical dispute about sinking versus scuttling has its roots. Junak's account describes a situation in the engine room during the final hour where he was receiving no orders from the bridge, because the bridge no longer existed as a functional entity, and was making engineering decisions on his own authority. The ship was flooding. He could not determine the exact rate from where he stood. The upper decks were being destroyed by shell fire. The gun battery was silent. He made the decision to initiate the scuttling procedure. The seacocks were opened. Explosive charges were set in the engine room, and the ship was prepared to sink by deliberate flooding of the machinery spaces. Whether this was done on standing orders established before the operation, on Lindemann's verbal instruction from an earlier period in the battle, or on Junak's own initiative, is a question the record cannot definitively answer. All three possibilities are represented in the historiographical literature. Junak believed he was doing what a loyal engineering officer should do in those circumstances. At approximately 1000 hours, Bismarck's guns fell silent. Rodney's gunnery report records this. The ship was still afloat, listing heavily to port, burning in multiple places above the waterline, but the hull below the armored belt, from what could be observed externally, appeared intact. Tovey, concerned about his own fuel state and the possible arrival of Luftwaffe aircraft from French bases, needed to finish the action. HMS Dorsetshire was ordered to close and fire torpedoes. She fired 3 Mark IX torpedoes, hitting twice on the port side and once on the starboard. The torpedoes added to the flooding that Junak's scuttling was already producing. At 10:35 hours, Bismarck began to capsize to port. At 10:36 hours on the 27th of May, 1941, she sank stern first, sliding beneath the surface in approximately 4,790 meters of water. Her flag was still flying when she went under. This detail appears in multiple accounts from both sides and is worth stating plainly, without interpretation. The flag was flying. Whatever that means to different observers, it was there. When I cross-reference the physical wreck evidence from Robert Ballard's 1989 survey, which found the hull below the waterline largely intact, with no evidence of shell penetrations below the main armored belt, with Junak's account of the scuttling charges and open seacocks, the picture that emerges is not ambiguous in its mechanical terms. The British shells killed the men and the working systems of the ship. The British torpedoes contributed to the flooding. Junak's scuttling charges and open seacocks produced the final physical act of sinking. The argument about who sank Bismarck is therefore, in a strict engineering sense, answerable.
The water that filled the hull and took the ship to the bottom entered primarily through deliberately opened valves and detonated hull fittings. The argument about who won is a different question, and not a difficult one. Bismarck sailed from Gotenhafen on the 19th of May. She sank on the 27th. She had completed no element of her operational mission. There is a specific detail in Guernsey's gunnery report that stays with me. In the final phase of the engagement, after Bismarck's guns had fallen silent and Rodney had closed to ranges that would have been unthinkable in a battle between two functional opponents, ranges of 3,000 yards, then 2,000, close enough for even the secondary battery to engage, close enough to see the damage being done. The report notes that the ship continued to receive fire until the end. Not because the British gunners were conducting themselves without humanity, but because a ship that is still afloat and still in enemy hands remains, under the operational logic of naval warfare, a ship that needs to be sunk. The ship was sunk. The men aboard it, those who had survived to this point, were then in the water. Chapter 11. The Rescue That Wasn't. Sharks, Orders, and 2,000 Men. The 27th of May, 1941, 10:36 hours. The North Atlantic, approximately 650 kilometers west of Brest, France. The sea is still running at force 5 to 6. The air temperature is approximately 10 degrees Celsius. The water temperature is between 12 and 14 degrees Celsius. Into this water, in the minutes following Bismarck's sinking, approximately 2,100 men entered. Those who had survived the 109 minutes of the final battle, those who had been in below-deck spaces protected from shell fire, those who had been sheltered by the massive armored structure that the British guns had failed to penetrate. Some were injured, some were not. All of them were now in a North Atlantic Sea in late May without survival suits, supported by life jackets, in water that would begin producing the physiological effects of hypothermia within approximately 30 to 60 minutes of immersion without insulation. The ships that had just sunk their vessel were nearby. Whether those ships would stop was a question that, in the next 90 minutes, would define the final casualty figure of the entire operation. HMS Dorsetshire was the closest British ship. Captain Martin ordered rescue operations to begin, and the ship lowered boats and threw scramble nets and ropes over the side. The work was physically difficult. The sea was still rough, the ship was moving in the swell, and hauling exhausted men out of cold water over a moving hull requires specific effort from the rescuing crew, as well as whatever the rescued man has left to give. In approximately 2 hours of rescue operations, Dorsetshire recovered 85 men. HMS Maori, a destroyer, recovered 2 more. 87 survivors, pulled from a sea containing approximately 2,100 men. The rescue continued until, at approximately 1300 hours, a lookout reported sighting what appeared to be a periscope. Captain Martin ordered rescue operations terminated. The ropes were cut. The ships accelerated away. The periscope alarm and the decision that followed it is one of the most carefully examined single operational choices in the entire story, and the examination has not produced certainty. What is not in dispute is the sequence. The alarm was reported, the order was given, the ships departed. What is disputed is whether the alarm was real. The War Diary of the Commander-in-Chief U-Boats from May 1941, covering the disposition of U-boats in the Atlantic during the period, and the individual boat war diaries accessible through the archives, do not place any U-boat within effective torpedo attack range of Dorsetshire at 1300 hours on the 27th of May. The nearest submarine, U-74, was approximately 60 to 80 miles distant, operating under orders to move toward Bismarck's last position, but not yet arrived. If the post-battle reconstruction of submarine positions is accurate, and these reconstructions are generally considered reliable for the German side, given the systematic record-keeping of the BDU war diaries, the periscope that a lookout reported seeing was either a genuine observation of something other than a submarine, or an error. Martin didn't know this. From his perspective, responsible for his ship and his crew, the alarm was the alarm. The The decision he made was the decision any captain in those circumstances might make. What the decision meant in human terms can be expressed with some precision. At approximately 1300 hours when Dorsetshire departed, there were roughly 2,000 men still alive in the water, water temperature 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. Without insulation, the onset of incapacitating hypothermia, the stage at which voluntary movement becomes impossible, begins at approximately 60 to 90 minutes of immersion. The transition from incapacitation to death from cardiac failure associated with severe hypothermia occurs at core body temperatures around 28 degrees Celsius, roughly 3 to 3.5 hours after immersion in those conditions. The ships left at 1300 hours. By 1500 hours, most of the men in the water would have been incapacitated. By 1600 hours, the majority would have been dead. The German supply ship Sachsenwald and the submarine U-74 arrived at the position in the afternoon and recovered 25 men from the water. 25. The Sachsenwald rescue report, archived at kbismarck.com, lists the 25 names. I want to say something directly here, rather than managing it with analytical language. The 25 men recovered by the German vessels after the British ships departed were alive when those ships left. They had survived the sinking, survived the battle, survived the initial hours in the water. There were, at that moment, not 25 survivors in the ocean. There were a much larger number, and the question of how many would have been alive when Sachsenwald arrived if Dorsetshire had stayed is one that the arithmetic of hypothermia allows us to roughly estimate. More than 25. How many more is a calculation I'm not going to make with false precision, because the exact conditions, the exact distribution of injuries and exposure times, and the specific location of individuals in the water are not recoverable from the available evidence. What I can say is that the number would have been larger than 25, and probably significantly larger. The decision to leave was understandable. Its consequences were not small. The 5 debriefing reports from German survivors rescued by the Sachsenwald and U-74, archived at kbismarck.com, are documents that I find particularly difficult to read in the straightforward, analytical way that the operational records permit. These men had just watched 2,000 of their shipmates die around them, had survived an engagement that lasted nearly 2 hours, had been in cold water for approximately 2 hours, and were being asked, under interrogation conditions, to provide technical and tactical information about the ship they had been serving on. The reports are precise about some things and vague about others in ways that suggest genuine exhaustion rather than deliberate concealment. They confirm the scuttling. They confirm the sequence of events in the engine room. They describe the bridge destruction and the loss of officers, and several of them describe, with a consistency that resists dismissal, watching the British ships accelerate away while men were still in the water, still on ropes alongside. This description appears in accounts produced independently of each other. It's in the record. The 115 total survivors, 87 from Dorsetshire, 2 from Maori, 25 from the German vessels, 1 additional man recovered separately, were dispersed to British custody and, in the case of the 25 recovered by German ships, debriefed by German naval intelligence before eventually entering the prisoner system. The British survivors were taken to ports in England and underwent interrogation by naval intelligence officers. The resulting reports were compiled as ADM 267/137, accessible through the archives. They were interviewed systematically, with questions about the ship's technical systems, radar equipment, fire control architecture, damage control procedures, and the sequence of events during the operation. They were, to put it plainly, valuable intelligence assets. The men who survived the rescue were immediately useful to their captors in ways that the men left in the water were not. This is not a comment on the morality of the intelligence operation. It is an observation about the institutional reality that surrounded the survivors from the moment they were pulled from the sea. The official German notification of casualties, the letter to Mrs. Scharhag, preserved in the kbismarck.com archive, is an example of the form, was issued within approximately 1 week of the sinking. The letter informs the addressee that her husband fell for the Führer and the fatherland. It contains no specific detail about how he died,
where he was stationed, or what the circumstances of his death were. It is a form letter with a name inserted. This is not callousness on the part of the naval administration. It is the standard instrument for communicating military death to civilian families, and it carries all the information that such instruments are designed to carry, and none of the information that families actually need. The families of the 115 survivors received a different kind of notification, or rather, in many cases, received nothing at all for an extended period, because the German Navy could not formally acknowledge men as survivors in British captivity without raising questions about the circumstances of their capture and the conduct of the rescue. The families of survivors were, for weeks, in an information limbo. The death letter had not come. The survival notification had not come. They waited. The official letter on Bismarck casualties that Raeder presented to Hitler at the Berghof Conference on the 6th of June, the record of which is archived at kbismarck.com, gives the total crew as approximately 2,221 men, with 115 survivors. The conference record shows Hitler's immediate concern shifting not to the men who were lost, but to the implications for Tirpitz, the surviving sister ship, and for the future deployment of German capital ships. This is not a moral judgment on Hitler. It is an observation about what the conference record shows was discussed and what wasn't. The men in the water on the 27th of May do not appear in the conference record of the 6th of June, except as a total casualty figure, 2,106, a number, in a briefing document, on a desk in Bavaria. Chapter 12. Interrogation. What the survivors knew. Late May, 1941. England. The Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center has received 87 German naval prisoners from HMS Dorsetshire, officers, petty officers, and ordinary ratings, the survivors of what British naval intelligence immediately recognized as the most significant single ship loss of the war to date. The intelligence value of these men was understood before the rescue operations had finished. A battleship of this class, purpose-built, state-of-the-art, incorporating the best available German naval technology of the late 1930s, had been operating in British waters for 8 days. Her fire control systems, her radar, her internal protective arrangements, her damage control architecture, all of it was information that British naval intelligence needed and had not previously been able to obtain from direct technical source reporting. The interrogation officers knew what they were looking for. The cover sheet of ADM 267/137, the compiled interrogation report, archived at kbismarck.com, contains the instruction that interrogation should be conducted with maximum discretion and that subjects should not be made aware of the extent of intelligence sought. This is standard interrogation practice. The specific addition is the note about radar. Someone had written questions about specific component identifiers for Bismarck's radar director system. Not general questions about whether she had radar, but specific questions about technical configurations. Someone in British naval intelligence already had a detailed partial picture of the ship's electronics suite and was using the survivors to fill in the gaps. The technical intelligence yield from the interrogations fell into roughly 3 categories, and it's worth being specific about each rather than treating them as a single, undifferentiated information gain. The first category was electronic and radar intelligence. Multiple survivors from different positions aboard the ship independently confirmed the fit of the FUMO-23 surface search radar, the Funkmessordungsgerät, operating in the approximately 375 to 400 MHz band, mounted on the forward and main rangefinder directors as a fixed mattress array. This information confirms something that British signals intelligence had suspected but not confirmed from intercept analysis alone, that Bismarck's own radar was operating during the Denmark Strait passage and was detectable by suitably equipped receiving equipment. The FUMO-23's fixed array architecture, it could not rotate to scan, the ship had to maneuver to search different bearings, represented a significant capability limitation compared to British rotating radar sets, and this difference was absorbed into post-battle assessments of German versus British radar doctrine. The second category of intelligence concerned fire control architecture, And this was, from a warship design perspective, arguably the most operationally useful information extracted from the interrogations. Survivor descriptions of how the main battery and secondary battery fire control systems were connected confirmed that Bismarck used a centralized director architecture in which the main battery and key secondary systems shared a common data bus through the fire control computing equipment in the director tower. When the director tower was destroyed, as it was in the final battle, the entire integrated fire control network went offline simultaneously, rather than degrading gracefully across independent systems. British ships of the same period used a similar director architecture, and the Bismarck interrogation reports contributed to a post-war design reassessment that emphasized cross-connected redundancy in fire control systems, the ability to maintain at least partial fire control function even after director loss. The specific disclosure came, in most cases, from ratings who were describing the physical layout of equipment they worked with daily, without any awareness that they were revealing an architectural vulnerability. They were describing their workplace. The intelligence officers were mapping a system. I find it genuinely striking when I set the interrogation reports alongside the U-boat archive's survivor interrogation transcript how much of the substantive technical intelligence came from men in technical ratings rather than from the 4 officers in custody. The officers were more guarded, professionally trained to manage disclosure under interrogation, aware of their obligations under the laws of war regarding what prisoners are required to reveal. The ratings were often technically specific in ways that exceeded anything the officers disclosed, not because they were less loyal, but because they didn't have the contextual framework to know which details were sensitive. A stoker describing the layout of the fuel system in the forward sections, confirming the vulnerability in the forward oil cells that Prince of Wales had exploited, was providing information of genuine intelligence value, while answering what probably seemed to him like a fairly mechanical question about his daily duties. The interrogation of technically skilled enlisted personnel is, the Bismarck case demonstrates, often more productive on specific capability questions than the interrogation of officers. This observation recurs in intelligence methodology literature right through to the modern period. The B-Dienst intelligence revelation is one that tends to get relatively little attention in the popular accounts of the Bismarck operation, but which has significant implications for how we understand the information environment that both sides were operating in. The Erfahrungsbericht der Bord-Bedienstgruppe Prinz Eugen. The experience report of Prince Eugen's onboard signals intelligence unit, archived at kbismarck.com, reveals that the German fleet's Bay-Dienst operators were reading British tactical naval cipher traffic in real time during the operation. They were receiving and decoding British contact reports, position estimates, and operational orders as they were transmitted. The implications of this are considerable. The German fleet commander was not operating in an information vacuum. He had access to British operational communications. The question that this raises, which the Atlantic Operation Report and the historiographical literature address without fully resolving, is why, given this access, the German side made the intelligence errors it did. The Rhys-Jones analysis in The Loss of the Bismarck argues that German decision-making was too slow and too hierarchically constrained to exploit the B-Dienst intercepts operationally, even when they contained useful information. The Herwig and Berkusen analysis in The Destruction of the Bismarck addresses the intelligence integration question from the planning side rather than the operational side, and reaches broadly similar conclusions about the gap between intelligence collected and intelligence used. The Raeder report to Hitler on the 6th of June 1941, delivered at the Berghof and recorded in the Führer Naval Conference documents archived at kbismarck.com, is a document that tells you as much by what it doesn't say as by what it does. Raeder was briefing a man who had lost, at considerable cost, his most prestigious naval asset, the ship whose launch he had attended, whose commander he had received at the Berghof, whose operational success had been presented to him as both militarily significant and politically important. The conference record shows Raeder framing the loss primarily in terms of British numerical superiority. The combined strength of the forces that had engaged Bismarck was overwhelming, and under those circumstances, no single ship could have been expected to survive.
This framing is not inaccurate, but it carefully avoids the question of whether the operation should have been launched at all, whether the tactical decisions at the Denmark Strait were sound, and above all, whether the loss of Bismarck to a strike from Swordfish biplanes was the kind of thing that should prompt a fundamental reassessment of surface ship doctrine. The conference record shows Hitler moving quickly to the implications for Tirpitz. He wanted guarantees that Tirpitz would not be risked in a similar fashion. What he received, in effect, were assurances that amounted to a commitment to keep her safe by keeping her in port. The most powerful surface combatant in the German fleet would spend the next 3 years in Norwegian fjords, never firing her main battery against another warship. The destruction of the supply ship network that had supported Rheinumbung happened within 3 weeks of Bismarck's sinking, and it deserves to be understood as a direct intelligence consequence of the operation rather than a separate event. The tankers Belchen, Lothringen, Esso Hamburg, and Gonsenheim, the supply ship Friedrich Brehm and Spitzern, and several other vessels connected to the support network were located and sunk by Royal Navy forces in June 1941. The intelligence that enabled their location came, at least in significant part, from the exploitation of German naval communications, the code-breaking work at Bletchley Park that was, at this period of the war, beginning to produce operationally useful results against German naval enigma traffic. The capture of the German weather ship Lauenburg on the 28th of June, 1941, itself one of the supply network vessels, yielded enigma materials and cipher keys that materially advanced Bletchley Park's ability to read German naval traffic with reduced delay for the remainder of 1941. The intelligence chain from Bismarck's operation to the supply ship network's destruction to the Lauenburg capture to the accelerated enigma exploitation is a sequence that wasn't visible to anyone at the time in its full extent, but that, in retrospect, represents one of the most consequential intelligence outcomes of the entire episode. When I was working through the sequence of events in June 1941, the supply ship losses, the Raider-Hitler conference, the formal transition of German naval strategy away from surface raiding, what struck me most was the speed with which the institutional consequences were absorbed and acted upon. Within 3 weeks of Bismarck's sinking, the supply network was gone. Within 2 weeks after that, the B-Dienst decryption of British naval cipher that had contributed to German operational planning throughout the spring was degraded, as the British, aware from their own Bletchley work that their codes were compromised, began the process of changing them. The institutional landscape of the Atlantic campaign in July 1941 looked substantially different from what it had been in April. Different in ways that flowed directly from the 8 days of the Bismarck operation and from the intelligence work that accompanied and followed it. The tactical event had structural consequences that extended well beyond the loss of one ship and the death of approximately 2,000 men. The formal notification to Bismarck crew families, the form letters, the typed announcements delivered to addresses in Hamburg, Berlin, Kiel, Bremen, and 100 other German towns and cities, went out in early June. The families of the 115 survivors would in most cases not receive official confirmation of their men's survival for some additional weeks, because the German Navy was managing the information environment around the loss carefully. The scale of the casualty list, more than 2,000 dead from a single ship in a single engagement, was not something that German propaganda was well positioned to absorb cleanly. The official communications were managed. The private grief was not manageable in the same way. In 115 German households, at some point in the weeks after May 27th, a different kind of news arrived. Not the form letter announcing death, but some confirmation, a Red Cross notification, an official communication routed through neutral channels, a letter eventually sent from a prisoner of war camp, that someone had come back from what most people had assumed was a total loss. 115 households. Among more than 2,000 others where the form letter had already arrived, and the waiting was over, and the particular silence of that kind of news had settled in. Chapter 13. The Broader Context. What the Atlantic Looked Like in May 1941. The 1st of May, 1941. Not the Denmark Strait, not the Norwegian fjords. A government office in London,
somewhere in the cluster of ministries that the war has turned into round-the-clock operations, where the heating is always slightly wrong for the season, and the filing systems have been reorganized 3 times in 18 months, and nobody can agree on the current version. A civil servant, not a sailor, not an officer, not anyone whose name appears in the naval histories, is working through the import capacity figures for the fiscal year. Tons of food, tons of raw material, tons of fuel. The arithmetic is not abstract for this person. It is the arithmetic of whether Britain eats next winter. On the desk, alongside the import projections, is a summary of merchant shipping losses for the year to date. The U-boat figures are in one column. The surface raider figures are in another. Someone has drawn a line under each column and totaled them. The person doing this arithmetic does not need to be told which column is larger. The answer is visible without adding anything up. The strategic context for the Bismarck operation is almost never discussed alongside the operational narrative, and I think this is a significant omission. Not because it diminishes what happened in the Denmark Strait and the North Atlantic, but because without it, the story reads as a naval adventure, rather than what it actually was, a symptom of a strategic competition that was being decided by completely different numbers in completely different places. In the 5 months from January through May of 1941, German U-boats sank Allied shipping at an average monthly rate that dwarfed anything the surface raider program had achieved in its entire operational existence. The cumulative total for those 5 months exceeded 2 million gross registered tons. Operation Berlin, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau crews that Raider had cited as justification for launching Rheinübung, had destroyed 115,622 gross registered tons across 2 months of operations by 2 battlecruisers. The U-boats were exceeding that in approximately 10 days. These figures were available to the German naval planning staff. They chose a particular way to read them. The monthly sinking rate that Raider's planning documents identified as necessary for strategic effect against British imports was approximately 750,000 gross registered tons per month, sustained, month after month, across all methods combined. This figure represented the point at which British imports would fall below the minimum threshold required to maintain war production and civilian food supply simultaneously. In May of 1941, the month of Rheinübung, the actual combined sinking rate from all German sources was approximately 325,000 gross registered tons. This figure includes U-boat sinkings, surface raider sinkings, air attack sinkings, and mine sinkings combined. It was approximately 43% of the required strategic threshold. The surface raider contribution to that total, from all active surface forces, not just Bismarck, was a fraction of the U-boat contribution. The strategy that Bismarck was the instrument of was not working, by the numbers, before she sailed. This is not a post-war retrospective judgment. The numbers were present in the planning offices in May 1941. What was happening simultaneously in the Mediterranean deserves more than a footnote, because it provides the most direct illustration of how the historical spotlight on Bismarck has distorted the proportional weight of concurrent events. Between the 20th and 31st of May, 1941, the same 11 days as the Bismarck operation, German airborne and air forces were engaged in the Battle of Crete. The Royal Navy's losses around Crete during those 11 days included 3 cruisers sunk and 6 destroyers sunk, with an additional 6 cruisers and 7 destroyers seriously damaged. The combined tonnage of British warships lost or put out of action in the Crete campaign during the same period as the Bismarck hunt substantially exceeded the tonnage of HMS Hood. The combined casualty figures from both campaigns, British and German, Bismarck and Crete, make the Mediterranean theater the larger human catastrophe by a considerable margin. The Bismarck story received, and continues to receive, the larger share of historical attention. This is partly because of Hood, because the loss of the largest warship in the Royal Navy produced an emotional and political response that the more distributed losses in the Mediterranean did not. And partly because the Bismarck story has a shape, a chase, a quarry, a conclusion, that translates naturally into narrative form.
The Mediterranean losses of May 1941 don't have the same shape. They were a grinding campaign of attrition. And attrition doesn't have a satisfying arc. Churchill's telegram to Roosevelt about Bismarck, archived at kbismarck.com and worth reading in full, uses the operation's emotional weight with conscious deliberateness. The loss of Hood is framed not simply as a naval setback, but as a demonstration of the threat that Britain faces, and the destruction of Bismarck as evidence of British resolution and capability. The subtext throughout is the argument for American material and political support that Churchill had been making since the fall of France. The Bismarck operation was a genuine tactical and strategic event, but it was also, in Churchill's hands, a diplomatic instrument. The emotional reality of Hood's loss, 1,415 men, the largest warship in the world, gone in 3 minutes, made the argument in ways that no policy paper could. The American press covered the hunt extensively. Ensign Leonard Smith's unofficial but real role in finding Bismarck gave American audiences a protagonist they could identify with. The operation's dramatic resolution gave them a conclusion. Churchill understood narrative as a political tool with a sophistication that very few wartime leaders matched, and the Bismarck story was a narrative he shaped as deliberately as he managed any other aspect of the Allied political relationship. Rader's position after Bismarck's loss was, professionally, untenable, in a specific way that the June 6th Berghof conference records make visible. He had guaranteed the operation's viability to Hitler over the objections of his own planning staff and the reservations of his fleet commander. He had cited Operation Berlin's success as justification. He had argued that the surface raider strategy was working and that Bismarck's deployment was the logical next step. Now the ship was gone, the crew was gone, the supply network was being systematically destroyed, and Tirpitz, the last and greatest surface unit remaining, was sitting in harbor because Hitler had made clear he would not permit her to be risked. Rader's strategic vision, the one he had built his career on, the commerce war conducted by surface raiders, was effectively dead. It hadn't been defeated by the British Navy in a tactical sense. It had been defeated by arithmetic and by a single torpedo hitting a specific piece of stern plating on a specific evening in the North Atlantic. He remained in his post until January of 1943, when he was replaced by Dönitz. The U-boat admiral who had always been his institutional rival inherited the Atlantic campaign that Rader had tried to win with battleships. When I was working through the Seekriegsleitung war diary entries for May and June of 1941, alongside the British Ministry of War Transport import analyses that survive in various forms, what struck me was a specific asymmetry in how the two sides were processing the same strategic information. The British import administrators were working with real numbers, actual tons arriving at actual ports, measured against minimum requirements for actual populations, and their concern was immediate and grounded in physical quantities. The German naval planners were working with projected numbers, theoretical sinking rates, estimated disruption indices, modeled import shortfall curves, and the gap between the model and the reality was growing wider with each month that the surface raider strategy failed to hit its tonnage targets. This is not an unusual pattern in military planning. The theoretical model and the operational reality tend to diverge, and institutions that have committed to a strategic concept tend to resist updating the model when the reality contradicts it. But the Bismarck case is a particularly clear example of the divergence becoming so wide that the operation was effectively over before it began in strategic terms, and proceeding anyway because the institutional momentum behind it was stronger than the analytical evidence against it. The routing cost argument. The idea that Bismarck's presence in the Atlantic, even without sinking ships, imposed costs on British convoy operations by forcing evasive routing, is the most defensible version of the case for the surface raider strategy's value, and it deserves a fair hearing. The Herwig and Berkison analysis makes this argument seriously, and the logistics of British convoy routing in the spring of 1941 confirm that the presence of German surface units in the Atlantic did force routing decisions that added distance, time, and fuel consumption to convoy passages. Adding 400 to 600 nautical miles to a typical North Atlantic convoy passage represented additional days at sea, additional fuel for escorts, additional exposure to U-boat patrol zones. The cumulative cost, across dozens of convoys over several months, was real. The question is whether this cost was proportionate to the resources Germany was committing to produce it. A battleship requiring a 7-ship logistics network, 2,000 men, and the strategic risk of its loss produced a routing disruption effect that could have been achieved at lower cost and lower risk by a submarine operating in the same general ocean area. The strategic efficiency argument for surface raiding over submarine warfare was never convincingly made in the German planning documents, because it couldn't be made convincingly with the numbers available. The supply ships deserve a final note in this chapter because their fate is, in a way, the most consequential logistical consequence of the entire operation. 7 vessels, carefully positioned across the North Atlantic over a period of weeks, representing months of planning and coordination. All 7 were located and destroyed by British forces in June of 1941, within 3 weeks of Bismarck's sinking. The intelligence that enabled their location was derived, at least in part, from Bletchley Park's exploitation of German naval communications, the code-breaking program whose existence would not be publicly revealed until the 1970s. The supply ships were destroyed without any German awareness that their communications had been compromised. From the German perspective, the British had found them through some combination of aerial reconnaissance, surface patrol, and possibly direction finding on their radio traffic. The actual mechanism, systematic cryptographic exploitation of German naval enigma, remained unknown to German naval intelligence throughout the war. The 6 tankers and supply vessels that were sunk in June 1941 were, from one perspective, collateral damage from Bismarck's operation. From another perspective, they were the operation's most strategically significant loss, because their destruction eliminated the logistical infrastructure for any future Atlantic surface raiding campaign before that campaign could begin. By the end of May 1941, the strategic picture of the Atlantic campaign had shifted in ways that were not immediately visible to anyone in either the British or German naval command. Bismarck was gone. Hood was gone. The supply network was about to be gone. Tirpitz was being moved into Norwegian fjords, from which she would not emerge for offensive operations. The U-boat campaign was accelerating toward what historians of the Atlantic War would later call its second happy time. With American entry into the war still 6 months away, and convoy protection still inadequately organized across the mid-Atlantic gap, the battle that the Bismarck operation had been part of, the battle for the Atlantic shipping lanes, would continue for 2 more years before reaching its resolution, and it would be resolved not by battleship gunnery, but by the slow accumulation of convoy protection improvements, centimetric radar, very long-range patrol aircraft, and the systematic exploitation of German naval communications by analysts working in converted stables outside London. The battleship drama of May 1941 was vivid and terrible and real. The logistics and the signals intelligence that determined the outcome were quieter. They were also more decisive. Chapter 14. The Ship Beneath the Ship. What Ballard Found in 1989. The 27th of May, 1989, exactly 48 years after Bismarck sank. A research vessel, the Storella, operating in support of Robert Ballard's expedition, is positioned above approximately 4,790 meters of North Atlantic water at roughly 48 degrees 10 minutes north, 16 degrees 12 minutes west, 650 kilometers west of Brest. The sonar suite that the expedition has been conducting for several days has returned an image that the analysts on the vessel are examining with the particular intensity of people who have been looking for something for a long time and have just found it. The return shows a large object on the seabed, oriented roughly north-south, mostly intact, with a debris field extending across several square kilometers of the surrounding ocean floor. The primary hull, the main section of what they are looking at, is upright, not on its side, not fragmented. Upright, or close enough to upright that the distinction matters for the question of how this ship sank. The physical condition of a wreck on the seabed carries information about how the sinking happened, and Ballard's team understood this before the first camera was deployed. An upright hull, one that settled to the bottom without catastrophic internal detonation or extreme violent capsizing, indicates a relatively slow, flooding-based sinking. A wreck fragmented by internal magazine explosion shows a different pattern. Smaller debris pieces, concentrated around the explosion point, with structural members displaced outward rather than simply settled. The Bismarck wreck's sonar image, even before the ROV dives began, showed the characteristic pattern of a flooding sinking rather than a detonation sinking. The bow section had separated from the main hull, but the separation point and the distribution of the bow relative to the main wreck were consistent with structural failure during the descent. In the approximately 5 to 7 minutes it would have taken a flooding hull of that displacement to sink 4,790 meters, rather than from an internal explosion during the battle. The sonar picture, read by people who knew what they were looking for, had already suggested a conclusion before the cameras confirmed it. The underwater survey that followed over several days of diving produced imagery that directly addressed the central post-war debate about Bismarck's sinking. The main armor belt, 320 millimeters of Wotanhart, face-hardened steel, inclined at 12 degrees from vertical, was examined as closely as the ROV cameras permitted. The belt showed impact craters, scarring, and spalling from heavy shell strikes. It did not show penetrations. The shells had struck the belt and deformed it, damaged its surface, transmitted enormous shock forces through it into the hull interior, but they had not gone through it. No shell penetration below the waterline was identified in the survey. This is not a subtle or ambiguous finding. The main armored belt of Bismarck, which protected the machinery spaces and the lower hull structure from the waterline down, had not been breached by British gunfire during the 109-minute final battle. The physical evidence on the seabed in 1989 confirmed what Junak had said in his memoir, and what the engineering analysis of British shell performance at those battle ranges had always suggested was probable. The main belt held. What this means for the sinking question is straightforward in engineering terms and complicated in national narrative terms. If the main armored belt was not penetrated, the flooding that caused Bismarck to sink could not have entered through shell damage to the protected hull. It had to enter through some other mechanism. The two available mechanisms are torpedo penetration through the unarmored hull below the belt, possible, though the torpedo survey evidence is less definitive than the shell evidence, and deliberate flooding through opened seacocks and detonated hull fittings, which is what Junak described. The James Cameron expedition of 2002, using more capable ROV technology than was available to Ballard in 1989, examined the machinery spaces through hull openings and found valve positions consistent with deliberate actuation rather than battle damage. This is as close as deep-sea survey technology can come to confirming a scuttling. The valve positions don't prove intent in a legal sense. They are consistent with what a senior engineering officer who has decided to open the seacocks would have done. Robert Ballard's published account of the expedition is careful about interpretation, and this carefulness reflects genuine scientific discipline rather than political management. He describes what the cameras showed and draws the conclusions that the evidence supports, but he resists over-claiming on questions where the evidence permits multiple readings. The conclusion he reaches, that the physical evidence supports the scuttling account more strongly than the British gunfire account for the actual sinking mechanism, is stated in qualified terms because he is a scientist writing about a subject where the data has limits. The Cameron expedition was less qualified in its interpretive language, and some naval historians have pushed back on Cameron's conclusions as going further than the evidence strictly allows. I think the disagreement between the two surveys is partly methodological, different tolerance thresholds for interpretive confidence, and partly a reflection of the fact that 50 years of deep-sea conditions affect the preservation of specific evidence in specific ways that are difficult to fully account for. What both surveys agree on, and what I think can be stated without qualification, is that the hull below the main armored belt was not penetrated by British shell fire. The wreck's position on the seabed reveals something else that tends not to be mentioned in the popular accounts: the specific depth. 4,790 meters places Bismarck below what oceanographers call the carbonate compensation depth, roughly 4,000 meters in most of the North Atlantic, below which calcium carbonate dissolves rather than accumulating. This means any organic material associated with the wreck has long since been consumed by the chemistry of the deep ocean and by the biological communities that colonize deep-sea wreck sites. The iron hull is being consumed at a slower rate by iron-oxidizing bacteria, the rustical colonies that Ballard's team also documented on Titanic, which rests at roughly similar depth. Naval architects and deep-sea biologists who have examined the rate of rustical colonization and iron consumption on both wrecks estimate that Bismarck's hull structure will be unrecognizable as a warship within approximately 20 to 40 years from the present. The ship that absorbed hundreds of heavy shells without sinking is being dissolved, slowly and completely, by organisms too small to see. It's a particular kind of patience that the deep ocean has. The legal status of the wreck is a question I find genuinely surprising when I first encountered it in the literature, and more surprising the more I looked into it. Bismarck lies in international waters, outside any coastal state's exclusive economic zone, in a part of the Atlantic where no national jurisdiction applies. Under the customary international law of war, a warship sunk in action is generally regarded as a war grave. The remains of military personnel are considered entitled to respect and protection analogous to a land-based gravesite, and as the continuing property of the flag state, the nation whose flag the vessel flew when active. Germany has never formally asserted sovereignty over the Bismarck wreck. The United Kingdom has never formally renounced any claim to it as the force responsible for its loss. In the absence of a bilateral agreement between Germany and the United Kingdom specifically addressing the wreck's status, it occupies a legal position that is unresolved. Multiple private ROV visits to the wreck have taken place over the decades since Ballard's expedition, some with scientific purposes, some without clear purpose beyond the visit itself, without formal permission from any national authority, because no national authority has formally established the jurisdiction to grant or refuse such permission. The ship has been on the bottom for more than 80 years. The question of who it belongs to remains technically open. When I was working through the wreck survey reports alongside Unok's memoir and the British gunnery records, the detail that keeps returning to me is the separation of the bow. The bow section of Bismarck lies some distance from the main hull on the seabed, having separated during the descent. The debris pattern between the bow section and the main hull is consistent with a structural failure at the point of separation, the forward bulkheads giving way under the hydrodynamic forces of the descent, rather than being torn apart by internal detonation. Now, this matters because the bow was the section of the ship most compromised by battle damage. Prince of Wales's 14-inch shell, the flooding of sections 20 to 21, the forward oil contamination that had been ongoing since the Denmark Strait battle on the 24th of May. 3 days of progressive forward flooding had weakened the structural integrity of the forward hull before the ship sank. The bow separated, on the evidence, because it was already the weakest part of the structure. The hit that started the operational sequence of failures, the hit that contaminated the forward fuel, that reduced the operational fuel by approximately 1,000 cubic meters, that drove the route decision that sent the ship toward the waiting concentration of British forces, left its final physical trace in the separated bow section on the floor of the Atlantic. Prince of Wales' contribution to Bismarck's end is visible, in a sense, on the seabed. The Ballard Survey's most important contribution to the historical record is not, I think, the specific findings about shell penetration or valve positions or bow separation, as important as all of those are. The most important contribution is the demonstration that the wreck can be asked questions and will, within limits, provide answers. The physical record of what a naval engagement produces, the actual material consequence, preserved below 4,000 meters of cold water, can be interrogated by people who weren't there and who can read what the evidence shows without the institutional pressures that shaped the post-battle reports. Raeder needed the loss framed as defeat by overwhelming numbers. The British Admiralty needed the loss framed as sunk by British action. UNOC needed the record to acknowledge what his engineering team had done. The wreck doesn't need any of these things. It just sits there,
being slowly consumed, carrying the specific physical record of what actually happened, in a way that the documents, shaped by the people who produced them, at the time they produced them, for the reasons they had for producing them, cannot always do. Chapter 15. The Ripples. What changed because of this? The 6th of June, 1941. The Berghof, Bavaria. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder is presenting his report on the loss of Bismarck to a man who does not like receiving bad news and has extensive practice in dealing with it by redirecting his anger toward future policy rather than past failure. The conference record, filed in the Führer Naval Conference documents and accessible at kbismarck.com, is a precise and illuminating document. It covers the tactical sequence of the operation, the causes of the ship's loss as Raeder understands them, the current disposition of remaining naval forces, and the implications for future policy. What it reveals, reading between the administrative language, is the moment when the Kriegsmarine's surface war strategy, the concept Raeder had spent his career building, received its institutional death certificate. Hitler wanted assurances about Tirpitz. He wanted to know that the surviving sister ship, currently being moved to Norwegian waters, would not be risked in a similar fashion. What he received were assurances that Tirpitz would not sortie into the Atlantic without conditions of air cover and tactical support that could not, in the operational reality of 1941, be provided. In practical terms, this meant Tirpitz would not sortie. The conference was the end of the strategy, even if the minutes don't say so in those words. Tirpitz's subsequent operational history is one of the stranger chapters in the naval history of the Second World War, and it flows directly from the June 6 conference's implicit policy conclusion. She was moved to Trondheim Fjord in January of 1942 and subsequently to various Norwegian anchorages, where she spent the remainder of the war as what naval strategists call a fleet in being, a force that constrains enemy planning through its existence rather than its action. The logic was not irrational. Tirpitz's presence in Norwegian waters forced the British to maintain substantial home fleet resources in northern Scotland that might otherwise have been redeployed. Convoys to the Soviet Union through the Arctic, the PQ convoy series, were routed and timed with constant reference to Tirpitz's position and readiness state. The resource burden she imposed on British naval planning was real. She participated in exactly one offensive operation, a shore bombardment of Spitsbergen in September of 1943, and fired her main battery against targets that did not return fire. The most powerful surface combatant in the German fleet never engaged another warship in her main battery's 4-year operational life. She was sunk by Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers using 12,000-pound tall-boy deep penetration bombs on the 12th of November, 1944, in Tromsø Fjord. 3 direct hits. The ship capsized, and approximately 950 men died. She had never done what she was built to do. The destruction of the supply ship network in June of 1941 was the most immediate and practically consequential result of the Bismarck operation, though it received less contemporary attention than the battleship drama of May. The systematic location and sinking of 7 vessels across the North Atlantic in the space of 3 weeks, guided by intelligence that the German naval staff believed was derived from aerial reconnaissance and surface patrols, and which was actually derived in significant part from the exploitation of German naval communications at Bletchley Park, eliminated the logistical infrastructure for Atlantic surface operations at a stroke. Raeder could have assembled another tanker network, in theory. In practice, doing so would have required bringing the vessels out of port, communicating their positions through a signal system that was compromised without his knowledge, and deploying them into waters that the British were now demonstrably capable of searching effectively. The operational environment that had made the supply network possible in the spring of 1941 had changed. It didn't change back. The Channel Dash of February 1942. The daylight passage of Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz-Eugen through the English Channel from Brest to German ports is inseparable from Bismarck's loss as a strategic consequence, though it is rarely framed that way. After Bismarck demonstrated that the Bay of Biscay approaches to French Atlantic ports were a hunting ground that British naval and air forces could exploit effectively, the three ships at Brest were in an exposed position. RAF Bomber Command was attacking the port. The threat of further torpedo bomber strikes, this time with more advanced preparation than the improvised victorious strike of May 1941, was real. Moving the ships back to German ports, where they could be properly maintained and from which they could theoretically operate in better supported conditions, was the logical consequence of the strategic dead end that Rheinübung had demonstrated. The Channel Dash succeeded tactically. All three ships reached German ports without being sunk, though Scharnhorst and Gneisenau both struck mines during the passage. But the passage itself was an admission of strategic retreat, and both sides understood it as such. The German surface forces had moved from attacking the Atlantic to running home through the Channel. The direction of travel was unmistakable. HMS Prince of Wales deserves a specific note in this chapter, because her subsequent fate carries a particular irony that the timeline of the war makes visible. On the 10th of December 1941, 13 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into the war, Prince of Wales was sunk by Japanese land-based torpedo bombers off the coast of Malaya. She was operating without fighter cover, within range of Japanese airfields in Indochina, in a tactical deployment that replicated the central vulnerability that the Bismarck operation had already demonstrated. A capital ship operating without adequate air protection in waters covered by land-based aircraft. The lessons of Toronto, of Pearl Harbor, of the Bismarck's vulnerability to Swordfish attack, they had all pointed toward the same conclusion about the relationship between air power and surface combatants. Prince of Wales, the ship whose 3 hits in the Denmark Strait had sealed Bismarck's operational fate, was destroyed by the same lesson applied by different hands 6 months later. Her captain, John Leach, died with his ship. He had been on the bridge of Prince of Wales during both engagements, the one where the lesson was delivered and the one where it was applied. Churchill's response to the news of Prince of Wales' loss is recorded more completely and more personally than his response to Hood's loss, perhaps because by December of 1941 he had the time and the perspective to record his reaction in writing. His memoirs describe being woken at 7 in the morning with the news and lying in bed for several minutes unable to respond. The communication failure between his intelligence and his physical capacity to get up being, in his account, a measure of the shock. He had known Prince of Wales well, had sailed on her to Newfoundland for the Atlantic Charter meeting with Roosevelt in August of 1941, the meeting at which the two leaders had committed to the principles of a post-war international order while sitting in a harbor surrounded by the same naval forces that had, 3 months earlier, been hunting Bismarck. The ship was not abstract to him. It had been the physical location of a significant moment in his political life. This does not change the strategic significance of her loss, but it adds a specific human texture to it that the official records don't capture. The doctrinal consequence of the combined lessons of Bismarck, Prince of Wales, and Pearl Harbor, all within 7 months of each other in 1941, was the most significant shift in naval doctrine since the transition from sail to steam. The theoretical arguments for aircraft carrier primacy over battleship firepower had been present in the naval literature since the 1920s. Billy Mitchell's demonstrations in the United States, the fleet air arms arguments within the Royal Navy, the Japanese carrier developments of the 1930s, the intellectual case had been made before the war began. What the events of 1941 provided was operational proof that could not be dismissed by institutional inertia. 3 of the most powerful battleships or battle cruisers in the world, Hood, Bismarck, and Prince of Wales, had been sunk or fatally compromised by air power in 7 months. The American battleships at Pearl Harbor had been put out of action on the same morning they were first attacked. The battleship era did not end on a single day. It ended in a sequence of demonstrations, each one adding to a body of operational evidence that eventually became too large to reinterpret as exceptional circumstances.
When I was reading the Fuhrer Naval Conference records from the second half of 1941, the months immediately after Bismarck, after Crete, after Prince of Wales, what struck me most was the absence of the surface raider strategy in the discussions. Not criticized, not formally abandoned, simply absent. The conversations moved to U-boat deployment, to Norwegian coastal defense, to the implications of America's entry into the war after December. The strategic concept that Rader had spent his professional life building, the war on British trade conducted by powerful surface ships, stopped appearing in the agenda items. This is how institutional strategies die, usually. Not in a formal recantation, but in a gradual withdrawal of attention, a quiet failure to schedule the next planning meeting on the topic that has stopped producing results. By the end of 1941, no one in the Kriegsleitung was writing planning documents for the next Atlantic surface raider operation. Nobody formally decided to stop. They simply stopped. The families of the men who died on Bismarck, on Hood, and on the dozens of ships involved in the wider Atlantic campaign of May 1941 lived with the consequences of these events in the particular way that families of the military dead live with things, quietly, privately, in spaces that the official histories don't enter. The form letters went out, the notifications came, life reorganized around an absence. The 115 Bismarck survivors who came home after the war, some after years in British prisoner of war camps, some repatriated earlier through exchanges, returned to a Germany that bore no physical resemblance to the country they had left. Hamburg, where Bismarck was built, was extensively bombed. Kiel, where she was commissioned, was extensively bombed. The dockyards where she was constructed and fitted out were rubble or repurposed. The institutional Kriegsmarine that had sent them to sea ceased to exist as a legal entity. The ship they had served on was on the floor of the Atlantic. What they came home to, in each case, was whatever specific version of survival and reconstruction their individual circumstances permitted. The operational history records them as 115 survivors. Their subsequent histories are not in the operational record. Chapter 16. Voices. The Men Who Came Home. A date that is not 1941. A room that is not a ship. Burkhard von Mullenheim-Reckberg is sitting, perhaps in the 1970s, perhaps the early 1980s. It's difficult to date the specific interview from the account alone. And speaking about the morning of the 27th of May with the particular quality of recall that the most important events of a life sometimes preserve. Clear in some details and strangely uncertain in others, the certainty distributed not according to logical importance, but according to the specific attention the brain was paying at each moment. He was Bismarck's 4th gunnery officer. He was in the aft fire control director throughout the battle, one of the highest points on the ship, watching the final engagement through optics that showed him exactly what was happening on the range plot while the ship around him was systematically destroyed. He survived because he was in a position that remained above water until the very end. He was in the sea for a relatively short time before Dorsetshire's crew pulled him out. He became, over the following decades, the most prominent and most frequently interviewed survivor of Bismarck, the man whose account became, for most subsequent historians and documentary makers, the canonical testimony of what it was like to be on that ship on those days. His memoir, published in German in 1980 and subsequently translated into English, runs to just over 300 pages. It is a serious and detailed account, and it shaped the history of this story more than any other single document produced after the fact. The Bruno Rezanka interview, archived at kbismarck.com, is a different kind of document. Rezanka was a rating, not an officer, not in a directorial position with a view of the battle's development, not someone who came back from the war and entered a professional and social world that provided the infrastructure for memoir writing and formal remembrance. He was a man who was on a ship that sank, who survived, who came home, and who was interviewed at some point by the Archive Project in a way that preserved his account in digital form. The interview is shorter than Mullenheim-Reckberg's memoir. It covers less ground, It is less analytical about the operational sequence and more specific about the physical experience of being below decks during the final battle. The noise, the motion, the uncertainty about what was happening above you, when what was happening above you was a Royal Navy gunnery engagement from close range. The two accounts describe the same event from positions that were, in terms of physical location aboard the ship, perhaps 200 meters apart. They read like accounts of different experiences. What I keep returning to when I read these accounts alongside each other is a specific observation about how rank shapes historical record. Müllenheim-Reckberg had the education, the professional connections, the access to publishers, the social position that made a memoir a natural instrument for processing and communicating his experience. He had the language, the technical vocabulary of a naval officer, the narrative frameworks of a professional who had spent his career in an institution with strong traditions of formal documentation, to turn his memories into a book. The book found a publisher, found readers, found its way into the footnotes of every serious historical work on the Bismarck operation produced in the subsequent 40 years. Rozanka's account exists in one archive. It is accessible to anyone with an internet connection, which is not nothing. That democratization of access is real and important. But it has not found its way into the footnotes of the historical literature in the same way. His experience of the same event, preserved in the same archive, carries less institutional weight than the officer's memoir. This is not a conspiracy or an intentional choice. It is the accumulated effect of 1,000 small decisions about whose account to cite, whose interview to seek, whose words to quote in the next book. The letter to Mrs. Scharhag, a single typed page in the German Naval Archive, preserved at kbismarck.com, occupies the other end of the scale from Müllenheim-Reckberg's 300-page memoir. Her husband was a matros, an ordinary seaman. The letter informs her that he fell for the Führer and the fatherland. It gives no specific information about how he died, where he was when the ship sank, whether he was above decks or below, whether he was alive for the final hours or killed earlier in the engagement. It is a form letter. It does its administrative function. It informs a wife that her husband is dead, without doing anything else. I don't read this as callousness on the part of the naval administration. I read it as the inevitable product of a system trying to process 2,100 notifications in a short period with limited information about the specific circumstances of individual deaths aboard a ship that went down with its log and its records. The letter is what the system could produce. It is not what Mrs. Scharhag needed. Those two things are the same gap that exists between the official record and the human reality throughout this story. Ted Briggs died on the 4th of October 2008 in Portsmouth at the age of 85. He was the last of the 3 Hood survivors, the last person alive who had stood on that ship's deck on the morning of the 24th of May, 1941, and survived what followed. He had spent decades as the living witness to Hood's loss, attending commemorations, speaking to school groups, giving interviews, carrying the weight of representation that falls on the sole survivors of catastrophic events. His memoir, published in 1985, contains the specific details that only a first-hand witness can provide. The taste of the oil in the water, the sound of the sea after the ship was gone, the face of a sailor on the Electra, who was sorry and didn't know how to say it. When Briggs died, the direct testimony chain from the Denmark Strait battle closed. No one alive in the world since 2008 has any first-hand memory of watching Hood sink or Bismarck fight. The event has completed its transition from living memory to archival record. What remains is documents, photographs, wreck surveys, and the secondary accounts of men who themselves are now gone, and the specific responsibility of anyone who works with this material to handle the distance between the archive and the experience with appropriate care. Robert Tilburn, who had been 18 years old when Hood sank, outlived Ted Briggs. He died in relative obscurity compared to Briggs, whose last survivor status gave him a specific institutional role in British commemorative culture. Tilburn's account of the sinking, briefer in the published record, less frequently cited, contains the same event from a slightly different position on the same deck. The Board of Inquiry records note his testimony. The memoir literature references him. He appears in the record as one of 3 survivors, present, accounted for, represented. His specific experience, the particular way the 24th of May 1941 felt from where he was standing, is less completely preserved than Briggs's, because the archive's attention settled elsewhere. This is not a criticism of anyone who made choices about whose account to pursue more deeply. It is an observation about how archival accumulation works. The more an account is cited, the more it is cited, and the accounts that are cited less accumulate less secondary material around them, and therefore become proportionally smaller in the historical record over time, regardless of the inherent value of what they contain. The German survivors who returned after the war, after years in British prisoner-of-war camps in some cases, after the surrender, the transition, the slow administrative process of repatriation, returned to a country that was in many cases physically unrecognizable. Hamburg had been extensively bombed. Kiel had been extensively bombed. The shipyards where Bismarck was built were damaged or repurposed. The institutional context that had defined their professional lives, the Kriegsmarine, with its ranks and traditions and forms of address, ceased to exist as a legal entity with the German surrender in May of 1945. What they came home to was whatever remained of the specific fabric of their pre-war lives, which in each case was different and in most cases was considerably less than what they had left. Mullenheim-Rechberg, in his memoir, describes this transition with the measured quality of a man who processed his experiences through writing. The ratings accounts, where they survive, describe it in more particular terms. The specific house that was gone, the specific person who wasn't there, the specific neighborhood that was rubble. The operational history calls them 115 survivors. Their subsequent histories are, in every meaningful sense, outside the operational record's scope. The families of the men who died on Bismarck never had a grave to visit. The North Atlantic at 48 degrees north, 16 degrees west, is not a place that admits a physical memorial. The wreck is there, below 4,790 meters of water, but it is not accessible to the bereaved, not visitable, not the kind of specific physical location that allows the particular work that gravesites do in the psychology of mourning. The German War Graves Commission, Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, which maintains military cemeteries across Europe and North Africa, has no jurisdiction over a wreck in international waters. The memorial that exists for the Bismarck dead is therefore primarily institutional and digital. The archived crew lists, the preserved letters, the interrogation reports, the kbismarck.com archive that has made primary documents accessible in a way that no physical monument could achieve. Whether this is adequate to the scale of what happened on the 27th of May, 1941, is a question that the archive cannot answer. It is not the kind of question that archives are designed to answer. Chapter 17. What the Atlantic Still Holds. Today. Not 1941. Now. The North Atlantic at 48 degrees north, 16 degrees west, is the same temperature it was on the 27th of May, 1941. Cold, gray-blue in overcast light, moving in the particular way that open ocean moves, in long swells that travel thousands of miles from their generating storms and arrive at this specific patch of water from directions that have nothing to do with the history that happened here. There is nothing on the surface to mark the position. The oil slick that Prince of Wales hit opened in the bow of Bismarck dispersed into the Atlantic within days of the sinking. The debris that surrounded the wreck, the deck fittings, the personal equipment, the material contents of 2,000 men's working and living spaces settled to the bottom or was carried off by current over the subsequent 80 years. Passing ships don't slow down here. There's no buoy, no marker, no navigational notation that distinguishes this square mile of ocean from the 1,000 square miles around it. Below, at the depth where light has not reached since long before anyone involved in this story was born, the hull is there, being consumed, slowly becoming something else. I want to begin the final chapter of this documentary with 3 questions that the archive cannot answer, because I think being honest about what the record doesn't tell us is the only responsible way to finish a story as extensively documented as this one. The first question is, what did the conversation between Lutyens and Lindemann actually consist of in the hours after the hood sinking, when the evidence suggests the 2 men disagreed about the tactical options? Survivor accounts imply a disagreement. The content of that disagreement is reconstructed from fragments. Both men died on the 27th of May. Their specific exchange, the words, the tone, whether Lindemann's reported desire to pursue Prince of Wales was a formal recommendation or a passing comment, whether Lutyens overruled him with an order or convinced him with an argument, is not in the archive. It never will be. The second question is related. What exactly did Lutyens know about his fuel state? And did he know it precisely or approximately when he transmitted at 20:56 hours on the 24th of May? The Atlantic Operation Report's fuel table has that one entry that says rounded, and I have read enough engineering reports to know that rounded in a context like that means someone stopped trusting the measurement. Whether Lutyens was given the precise figure or an estimate shapes whether his route decision was rational under the available information or rational despite incomplete information. The third question, what was the nature of the contact that HMS Dorsetshires Lookout reported at approximately 1300 hours on the 27th of May? The submarine war diaries place no German U-boat within effective range. The question of what was actually seen, a wave breaking in a particular way, a piece of wreckage creating a silhouette, something else entirely, is unanswerable with the evidence that survives. The Bismarck's war diary, the Kriegstagebuch, is at the bottom of the Atlantic, 4,790 meters down, inside a hull that is being slowly consumed by bacteria. It went down with the ship. What exists in its place is a reconstruction, the Atlantic Operation Report, compiled after the battle from radio transcripts, from the Prince Eugen's surviving war diary, from survivor accounts, from German signals intercepts of British communications, assembled by people who were doing their best to piece together what had happened from the fragments that remained after the ship and its records were gone. This is a critically important thing to understand about the primary German source for this entire story. It is not a contemporaneous document. It is an institutional reconstruction, assembled under the specific conditions and for the specific purposes of the naval staff that produced it. Every entry in that report is an approximation, a best available reconstruction of events that the people who experienced them directly had, in most cases, either died in or were too far from the ship's record-keeping systems to verify independently. We have been working, for 17 chapters, with a document that is as close as the German side could get to what happened, rather than with what happened itself. The distinction is real, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging it. The ultra-intelligence material that shaped the destruction of the supply ship network, and that may have played some indirect role in the broader intelligence picture around the Bismarck operation, was classified until approximately 2003, 62 years after the events it describes. The full scope of Bletchley Park's contribution to the North Atlantic Campaign in 1941 was not available to historians writing about those events until well into the 21st century. This means that every account of the Bismarck operation written before 2003 was working with an incomplete picture, not through any failure of research, but because the intelligence material that completed the picture was legally restricted. The shape of the story was being edited by a wartime security classification that outlasted the war by more than 50 years. Some of the things that historians said with confidence before 2003 about why certain British operational decisions were made, about what Tovey knew and when he knew it, about how the supply ships were found, about the specific role of signals intelligence in the broader hunt, needed revision once the ultra material became available. The history of this operation, in other words, was still being corrected more than 60 years after the events occurred. It may still be being corrected in ways we don't yet know. The historiographical debates that remain genuinely open, that I've tried to present honestly throughout this documentary rather than resolving artificially, are worth naming plainly in this final chapter.
Whether Bismarck was sunk by British naval action or by UNAC's scuttling is a question that the physical evidence answers in engineering terms, but that the historical literature continues to contest in terms of its moral and strategic meaning. Whether Lütjen's radio transmissions on the 25th and 26th of May were rational decisions based on his intelligence picture, or reflected something closer to fatalism, is a question about the interior life of a man who left no record of his interior life after the 15th of May, 1941. Whether the German surface raider strategy had genuine strategic merit that the British routing cost imposed on convoys represents, or whether it was a strategically inefficient program that consumed enormous resources for results that submarines were achieving at lower cost, this is a debate between serious scholars who have access to the same evidence and read it differently. The evidence permits different readings. The debates are genuine. Anyone who tells you they are settled is either selling something or hasn't read the primary sources carefully enough. The 27 ships and submarines involved in the hunt for Bismarck, British, German, and American, were crewed by approximately 50,000 men in total, not counting the shore establishments, the intelligence analysts, the signals operators, the meteorologists, the fuel depot workers, and the dozens of other categories of people whose work made the operation possible on both sides. Of those 50,000, approximately 3,521 died in the 8 days between the 19th and the 27th of May, 1941. 1,415 on Hood, approximately 2,106 on Bismarck, and in the water after her sinking. The operational record accounts for these men as casualty figures in after-action reports. The casualty figure is where the operational record stops and where the human record begins. And the human record, the form letters, the archive interviews, the memoirs, the absence in specific households of a specific person who didn't come back, is not fully recoverable from any archive. What the documents preserve is an outline of what happened. What happened was larger than the documents. It strikes me, sitting with this material after the better part of a year working through it, that the most honest thing I can offer at the end is not a summary or a verdict, but an observation about method. The hunt for Bismarck is one of the most documented naval events in military history. The primary sources, the German war diaries, the British Admiralty records, the survivor accounts, the interrogation reports, the wreck surveys, the intelligence material released over decades, are extensive and accessible in a way that few comparable events are. And yet, the key decision-maker on the German side left no record of his thinking after the 15th of May. The critical conversation between the two most important figures aboard Bismarck is reconstructed from fragments. The central question of who sank the ship is answered differently by different categories of evidence. The identity of the person who made the DF plotting error that nearly let Bismarck escape is not recorded anywhere accessible. The experience of 2,000 men in the North Atlantic water on the morning of the 27th of May is recoverable only through 25 survivor accounts in the thermodynamics of hypothermia. The archive is vast, and the archive has gaps. And the gaps are not randomly distributed. They fall, with a consistency that is itself a pattern, on the moments and the people that the institutional record-keeping systems were not designed to capture. By 0847 hours, on the 27th of May, 1941, the moment Rodney opened fire and the final chapter of the operational story began, everything that mattered about the outcome had already been decided. Prince of Wales' 14-inch shell had entered the forward bow section on the 24th. The fuel had been bleeding for 3 days. The rudders had been jammed for 11 hours. The crew had been at action stations through the night without rest. The intelligence picture on the British side was clear enough to put 2 battleships in the right place at the right time. The intelligence picture on the German side had been wrong about the King George V's position since the Denmark Strait, wrong about the radar contact status on the 25th, wrong about whether the long radio transmission would give away the position. By the time the guns opened, the operational story was resolved. What remained was the human story. The 109 minutes of a ship that would not stop fighting, the water at 13 degrees, the 25 names in the Sachsenwald report. the form letter to Mrs. Shahag, the single question mark in a different hand on the board of inquiry diagram. These are the things that stay. The ship is at the bottom. The documents are in the archives. The ocean, at 48 degrees north and 16 degrees west, continues to move in the long swells that travel from distant storms and arrive here without any particular care for what happened above this specific patch of water on a specific morning 85 years ago, before the light came fully up and the last battle began.